to walk us through it. So, Mark, I just want to first get you to talk about anything big that you're seeing that's coming out of this, maybe anything surprising or super significant, and just sort of what are primary voters looking for most in a candidate? Do we know that yet?
Yeah, Savannah, let's actually start with what you just said. What are they looking for? And in Michigan, and this is the prize of the night, you end up having 57% of Democratic primary voters saying the most important thing to them is a Democratic nominee who can beat President Trump. Now, that shouldn't be all that surprising if you've been covering this race over the past year. But what is interesting is that Joe Biden in previous contests has usually overperformed with these types of voters versus Bernie Sanders, who's usually done better with the voters who end up saying that a candidate who agrees with them on the issues is the most important thing. And Savannah, it's just not in Michigan. Also in Missouri and in Washington state, we end up having about 6 in 10 or higher voters who end up saying that beating Trump is their number one concern and what they're looking for most from a candidate. Absolutely. That is quite staggering to see that much of a split there in those 3 states that you mentioned. So now let's talk a little bit about race and the role that that's going to play in the 6 states that are voting today. We know historically former Vice President Biden has had strong support from black voters. Is that what we're seeing? Do we have any information on exit polls on that? So we're not going to break out the splits on how Biden and Bernie Sanders are actually doing demographically, but I can actually walk you through what these electorates look like right now. And again, let's start with Michigan, where we end up having 72% of the Democratic electorate is white versus 18% that is African American. And then in 2016, Hillary Clinton did much better among African American Democratic primary voters in Michigan, and Bernie Sanders did better with white Democratic primary voters. But then let's look in Mississippi, which is a very different electorate than in Michigan, where you end up having 64% of the electorate that is African American versus 31% that's white. That African American percentage is actually a little bit less than what we ended up seeing back in 2016. But so far, this is the most African American oriented electorate of the Democratic primary season in the state of Mississippi. We'll just have to see what that's going to do for Biden later on tonight. Mark, Washington also heading to the polls today. And of course, it's one of the states hardest hit by the coronavirus. Now, we know that they have moved to mail-in voting, and they were a caucus. Now they're a primary. What impact is that having, though, that the state is really sort of focused on that public health crisis? Yeah, according to the exit polls in Washington state, you have 82% of Democratic primary voters saying that they are concerned about coronavirus that's actually gone on. And it's evenly divided between those who say that they are very concerned versus those who are somewhat concerned. But you can definitely tell it's on their minds. And Savannah, you mentioned about the mail-in aspect of voting in Washington state. Everyone gets a ballot sent to their home. They're allowed to mail it in. That probably gives you a whole lot more flexibility than going to your normal polling site in Washington state. You can just drop off your mail ballot in particular drop centers or mail that in. And again, that gives you a whole lot of flexibility, and you don't have to go to a polling place to vote. They are allowed to mail it in, but they are not supposed to lick the envelope, I know. I don't know what they're doing there. For fear of the spread of coronavirus. Thank you so much, Mark. I'm sure we'll be checking in with you throughout the night. Thanks, Savannah. For more on what we're learning from the exit polls, we're bringing in NBC News national political reporter Steve Kornacki.
Voting still going on in these states, but we're getting our first look here at what the electorate looks like today in some of these big primaries. So take you through some of the things we're finding. First of all here, take a look. This is Mississippi, one of the states up tonight. You see here in the exit poll just what the electorate looks like. In Mississippi, almost 2/3 black, according to this exit poll. That is the biggest number we have seen yet in any state that's voted. In South Carolina, the previous high, the number was 57. It's 64% here in Mississippi. Of course, we've seen the struggles that Bernie Sanders has had in building support with black voters. We saw earlier this week he had that event in Mississippi that he canceled to go up and campaign in Michigan. So you see the number here in Mississippi. This has, we've seen in other places, spelled trouble for Sanders. We will see what that means as the results come in tonight. 2 other big states voting tonight. Missouri, here at 17% black is the electorate here. Again, this was actually the closest state in the 2016 primary. Sanders versus Clinton. He lost to Clinton by about 1,500 votes here, 17% black. And if you take a look in Michigan here, the electorate 18% black. Notably, Michigan in 2016, it had the highest share of black voters of any state that Sanders won. This number was actually 21% in 2016. Remember, Sanders won Michigan narrowly. There is no state in 2016 that had a higher concentration of black voters that Bernie Sanders was able to win in. So we'll keep an eye on that tonight. And the other divide we're going to keep an eye on here demographically, this is among the white voters in these states, Missouri, Michigan in particular, that non-college, college divide. One of the key ingredients for Sanders in being able to win states and be competitive with Hillary Clinton through the primary season in 2016. It was strong support. Boy, Green was not a good choice here. It was strong support from non-college white voters. See a big chunk of the electorate. This is Missouri you're looking at here. Also, you look in Michigan, 37% of the electorate there, non-college white. Sanders was winning this group by double digits against Hillary Clinton last time around. We're going to be keeping a close eye, Ari, as these numbers come in. Is he able to do that again, or has there been some slippage?
Joe Biden is looking to repeat his Super Tuesday surge, but no matter what we see tonight, his campaign has already canceled their primary night rally in Cleveland, Ohio, out of an abundance of caution due to the coronavirus. NBC News political reporter Ali Vitale is in Cleveland and joins us now. Hi, Ali. So first, let's just start with what's the campaign saying about this cancellation?
Well, look, this is the first time that we've seen 2020 campaign events canceled because of the coronavirus outbreak. And prior to tonight, when both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden had to cancel their rallies here in Cleveland, we knew that the campaigns had been in touch with local health officials on the ground wherever they were campaigning. Then flash forward to tonight, the Republican governor here putting out a tweet saying that you probably shouldn't be gathering in indoor spaces with large numbers of people. The Bernie Sanders campaign went first, saying they were canceling their event, the senator flying back to Burlington, Vermont. Then the Joe Biden campaign quickly after that saying they were canceling their event here. Biden now going to address media on this eventful night from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where his campaign is headquartered. And really, I think that this is just another moment in this 2020 campaign where campaigns have been forced to figure out how to creatively campaign with circumstances out of their control. First, it was senators being stuck in Washington, D.C. for impeachment. Now it's coronavirus and this public health outbreak and what that could mean for the campaign trail, because I think we're entering a whole new phase. This is campaigning in the age of coronavirus, Savannah.
Absolutely. Has the Biden campaign actually said anything about that, sort of addressing the fact that big rallies and events are a huge part of campaigns and sort of needing to get creative with how they're going to reach voters, if not at in-person events?
Look, I think it's a new reality, and all they said for tonight is that everything is going to be done on a case-by-case basis. That's what these campaigns, including the Sanders campaign, have been saying for the last couple of weeks. And so I think this is how they go forward now, case-by-case, state-by-state, county-by-county, assessing with local health officials if it's safe and if it's prudent to be doing these kinds of campaign events that really are, you're right, the bread and butter of campaigning for president.
Absolutely. Now, can you just give us a quick snapshot of how the Biden campaign is feeling going into tonight? What are they expecting out of these states?
Look, Savannah, you heard Steve Kornacki talking about that large number of black voters voting in places like Mississippi and Missouri. Those are the states that the Biden campaign is looking at with confidence. They know what black voters have been able to do to Joe Biden's candidacy, supercharging him in places like South Carolina, helping him push himself over the finish line and to wins in several states across the board on Super Tuesday last week. What they're hoping for is that those states in the South can do that again. Of course, you look at another state that's on the map tonight, Washington State. That's a place where Bernie Sanders did really, really well in 2016. But of course, the big state tonight is Michigan. You heard Mark Murray talking about it, not just because that's where the delegates are for tonight, but because that's a state that Democrats are really looking at for 2020 in the general election, a place where President Trump did well, a place where President Trump hopes to do well again, but also a place that has counties like Macomb County, where we've seen potentially more moderate Republican voters shying away from President Trump. Those are the kinds of voters that Democrats are hoping to pick up in the 2020 general election. And frankly, it's places like tonight where we're going to look and we're going to see these candidates, whoever ends up winning there, are going to have an argument to make looking forward to the general election on how they did in Michigan. Not to mention, it gets them one delegate closer, delegate by delegate closer, to actually clinching the nomination.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us on a busy night, Ali. The Sanders campaign also canceled its rally in Ohio tonight out of caution. NBC News political reporter Josh Letterman is in Cleveland, Ohio. So, Josh, now, if the Sanders campaign is not having this rally, where are they tonight? What are they doing since it's been called off?
Well, Bernie Sanders himself on an airplane right now, flying back to Burlington, Vermont, to his home after the rally here in Cleveland, was scrapped at the last minute along with that Joe Biden rally because of coronavirus concerns. Here in Cleveland, shock and disappointment among the Bernie Sanders supporters, volunteers that we spoke with who were lined up ready to go into the convention center right behind me when they got word, some by text message, others from us, from the media who had showed up and had gotten an early word from the campaign that this was no longer happening. People who had driven from all across the state to spend the evening with Bernie Sanders. But as Ali was just saying, this is going to be the new normal. The Sanders campaign saying that they made this decision after a tweet from the governor here, Mike DeWine, who had tweeted that he was urging indoor sporting events not to be held in the midst of these concerns. That tweet made its way to Bernie Sanders himself, and he personally made the decision that at this point he did not want to hold the event. We are told, and the Sanders campaign telling us as he's flying back to Vermont tonight that they're not sure about future events, just like the Biden campaign. They're going to take it case by case as they continue to discuss with public health officials what makes the most sense going forward.
Josh, from those people that you saw that had been lining up, what was their reaction to this? Was it mostly disappointment that had been canceled, or were they concerned about coronavirus and thought, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't be in this crowd?
People generally understood that people were acting out of an abundance of caution and needed to do this. There was disappointment and some concern about how this is going to particularly affect a campaign like Bernie Sanders, because he has been placing such an emphasis on these massive rallies where he's able to get 11, 12, 13,000 people, as opposed to the retail politicking that kind of lends itself to Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders doesn't really do that. This is his venue. And if he's not able to bring these massive crowds out to rally in support of him, that's going to really have to change the way that he runs his campaign going forward.
Yeah, they're going to have to get a little bit creative. Let's switch over to voting tonight. So Michigan is seen as this critical test for Sanders for his hope for the White House. His campaign even calls it a narrative-changing state. Why is that? Why so much emphasis there?
Well, there's a lot of history here for Bernie Sanders after he pulled off an upset win against Hillary Clinton in the primary here 4 years ago. The Sanders campaign says they're hopeful, but they're not quite predicting he's going to be able to pull off that once again. The polls showing he's currently quite a bit behind Joe Biden in the polls leading up to today. But it's going to be a really critical contest in Michigan in particular for him for a couple of reasons. Part of it is about the African-American vote that he's been unable so far to really win in the South. But there's also a lot of black voters here in the Midwest. The Sanders campaign will be looking to see whether he's able to do better with African Americans in the Midwest than he is in the South. And the other element of this, Savannah, every time Bernie Sanders is asked, what is the math that gets a socialist elected president in America? He says, look, I'm going to bring in all of these new young voters into the process for the first time. So far, we have not seen that in the contests that have happened up until now. But whether he's able to bring new people into the process in states like Michigan, in states like Ohio and Indiana, these Midwest states that are coming up, is going to be really critical to whether Democrats are able to win this in the fall.
Absolutely. We'll have to see if they do come out. So Biden already leads Sanders in delegate counts. What is the Sanders campaign doing to slow Biden's momentum? How are they feeling about that?
Yeah, and that's part of the reason he needs a win tonight, at least in Michigan. He needs to be able to show that he still has some support, some momentum, because the last couple of weeks really have been trending in Joe Biden's direction. And that's why the Bernie Sanders campaign, in addition to canceling several events in other states to make sure he had more time to spend in Michigan, has also been deploying the best and the brightest of his surrogates. Congresswoman AOC, Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib from Michigan, as well as Danny Glover, other entertainment figures, really fanning out across the country to try to show that there still is momentum and excitement behind the Bernie Sanders campaign.
All right, Josh, thank you so much. Thanks for keeping us posted on all that. Good luck tonight. NBC's County to County election series is focusing on 5 key counties across America that could be bellwethers in the 2020 presidential election. Tonight, we're looking at Kent County, where President Trump won in 2016 by just over 10,000 votes. Dasha Burns is with me from Grand Rapids. Dasha, all right, you're where it's all happening. You've been spending time with voters today. What can you tell us about what you're hearing from Democrats?
Hey, Savannah. Well, I just heard Josh Letterman talk about Sanders' big upset victory here in Michigan in the 2016 primary, and whether or not he can do that again is top of mind for the campaign, but it's also top of mind for voters here who are trying to figure out that exact electability question. And back in the 2016 primary, Bernie Sanders carried this county by a big margin. But then in 2016, Donald Trump won Kent County. And so voters here are trying to figure out who is a candidate that can get Kent County back, that can get Michigan back. And they're wrestling with that idea of what to prioritize. Is it electability, or is it a candidate that more closely matches their views and their ideology? So take a listen to a little bit of what we heard in our conversations with voters here today. Can I ask if you're comfortable sharing with us who you voted for?
I voted for Bernie. He was not my initial choice. I was going to vote for Elizabeth Warren, but in light of her dropping out, I went with the next progressive option.
Do you think he can win Michigan? He did it in 2016 in that primary. Do you think he can do it again?
I'm not entirely certain. I think that there's a lot of momentum for Joe Biden at this particular moment. I think that he is also a strong candidate. If he is who ends up winning the nomination, I won't be upset about that.
And just, I mean, the race changed so quickly. You know, a week ago, were you expecting that you would be able to vote for Warren today?
I did. And, you know, and I've changed from Harris to Warren. You know, I've gone through
the evolution.
Yeah, and Bernie, it feels more of a city choice as opposed to Biden feels more like the suburban choice.
Interesting.
It's a safety choice in some ways, not that what Sanders is going for is radical, but I do think that people right now are scared. And so I think that people are going to go towards Biden just for the feeling of safety.
Well, I'm a new dad. I've got 2 young kids, so obviously a lot of what I vote for is thinking of the future, thinking of their lives, and how policies that are going to be enacted now are going to affect them.
And can I ask who do you think is the best shepherd for their future?
Bernie Sanders, 100% all the way, and I just think that overall he's our best bet to beat Donald Trump.
Who do you think is best positioned to beat Donald Trump?
For me, it's Biden.
Joe Biden? Why Joe Biden?
I just think he has the experience and the calming effect. I see Bernie, and he seems like an angry old man. And some of the stuff he talks about and the way he acts strikes me as just being like Trump.
And Savannah, we heard similar sentiment from other voters we talked to as well. The Biden voters really thinking about electability when casting their ballots, and the Bernie Sanders voters thinking about who they think more so aligns with their views. And even the people who did vote for Sanders today, a lot of them conceded that they still think it's probably going to go Biden's way here today. They're looking at the polls and they're sort of making those assumptions. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but they say they want to still vote for the candidate that they believe in versus prioritizing electability like we're hearing from so many other voters.
Definitely will be interesting to see if that trend that you were hearing from voters continues, because we did just hear earlier from Mark Murray, who actually said that 57% of those Democratic voters place more importance on if the candidate can beat Donald Trump than if they really align with them, which is kind of interesting that that's the way it's going. How has voter turnout been today? Have you seen any long lines or anything like that?
No long lines, but a steady flow, and we've been popping in and out of that room there, checking in on numbers. Last we checked, just over 400 ballots cast today in person. But there's this added element of absentee ballots. There have been 220 absentee ballots cast for this precinct. So altogether, that brings us to over 600 ballots cast. Compare that to 2016. There were over 800 ballots cast here. Wow. But remember, in 2016, there was a contest on both sides. Here, it's really just on the Democratic side. And so that brings the turnout percent in this precinct to about 35%, which is pretty significant. It was 50% in 2016. But again, for a one-sided contest here, 35% at this time is still pretty significant, Savannah.
And you mentioned those absentee ballots. We've been hearing about a delay with those. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so as of last year, when the new Secretary of State took office, they expanded the options for voters to allow anyone who wants to vote by mail-in ballot, which might be part of the reason we're seeing pretty significant turnout and absentee ballots cast here. But it also means it might take a while to count those, because by Michigan law, even though the majority of those ballots have been sent back, so people have sent in their absentee ballots, but they cannot begin to open and count those until the day of the election. So even though a lot of those ballots were sent before today, they couldn't actually start that counting until this morning. So that just could potentially slow down the process. About 1 million absentee ballots were sent out by the state of Michigan. Over 800,000 of them have been sent back, but that's going to take a little time to do all that counting, Savannah.
Yes, we've gotten used to waiting a little bit during this primary and caucus season. Dasha Burns in Michigan.
It's the story of the 2020 primary.
Exactly. Dasha Burns in Michigan, 125 delegates up for grabs tonight. Thanks for joining us.
Tonight, the race is down to the top 2 candidates. With contests in 6 states, will a clear frontrunner emerge? NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Casey Hunt and our road warriors bring you all the results. Special coverage begins tonight at 8 Eastern on NBC News Now.
We get to have our very own Today Family Getaway.
It's so exciting to be here.
We are serving up a Today Cafe special.
Universal Orlando Resort is the place. We have just loved seeing your beautiful shining faces.
How sweet is that?
Need your true crime fix on the go? Dateline episodes are available as podcasts. Mysteries with a twist from the True Crime Original. Wow. Listen to Dateline wherever you get your podcasts.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news. This is all I've got left.
Who brought more to the caucuses?
It's news made for your streaming world. Live weekdays, 3 to 11 p.m. Eastern.
We've got this fundamental thing about human beings, and then we've got the way that we constitute our politics. And the danger is that if our politics grow too tribal, then we'll lose this sort of way of talking.
Why is this happening? With Chris Hayes. Subscribe now.
The coronavirus task force, headed up by Vice President Mike Pence, says federal health officials are working with states and commercial labs to provide coronavirus tests to everyone that needs one.
We've made great progress over the last week. 1 million tests are in the field. Every state lab in America can do coronavirus tests. If you're concerned that you have coronavirus, your doctor can contact the state lab, can have a test processed. By the end of this week, another 4 million tests will be distributed.
Meanwhile, the president met with congressional leaders in an effort to hammer out some plans for fiscal stimulus to offset the effects of coronavirus. NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker has the details from the White House.
Hi, Savannah. Good evening to you. The president and this administration are working to calm the fears on Main Street and on Wall Street about coronavirus. In a briefing late today, the vice president saying that by the end of this week, there will be more than 4 million tests available all around the country, and 1 million are already in place. But leading NIH Dr. Anthony Fauci underscored seniors and Americans with pre-existing conditions need to take serious precautions. Fauci saying, quote, "It doesn't matter if you're in a state that has no case or one one case, take seriously what you can do now, that if and when the infections will come, and they will come, sorry to say, sad to say, they will. That's a quote from Fauci. Meanwhile, earlier today, the president personally pitched Republican senators on his ideas to bolster the economy on Capitol Hill. According to administration and Senate sources, among the measures he floated, a payroll tax cut through the end of the year and expanding paid family leave. But the president could be on a collision course with Democrats who argue a tax cut would not help everyone. Now, the president did not provide any information about when a plan will be finalized or how much it'll cost, only saying he'll announce more details soon. Savannah.
89 delegates are up for grabs in today's Washington state presidential primary, and the state is also one of the hardest hit by the coronavirus. Now, Washington just happens to vote entirely by mail, but it is still taking extra precaution. Steve Patterson is with me from Renton, Washington. Hey, Steve, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Savannah.
Washington has the highest number of deaths from coronavirus in the nation. Walk us through the precautions the state is taking with this primary happening today.
So first of all, there were a number of things that thankfully happened well before this outbreak even started. One is the decision to have a vote by mail election, which means essentially there's a long window of time that voters can just simply choose who they want and then send their ballots in by mail. That's huge. The second thing is that for one of the first times that the delegates are being assigned by primary instead of caucus. For a long time, this was a caucus state. And if you've ever seen a caucus, which I think you have, Savannah, that is a lot of people congregating into small spaces. It would be terrible, maybe even disastrous for an election like this. And so what's happening now is that on the back end of things, they're trying to keep workers safe. There's a state campaign that says healthy or sick, don't lick. They're talking about ballots. So they want people to use a sponge, use like a wet cloth, anything to seal the ballot so it doesn't infect the envelope, because we still don't know how long coronavirus sticks to surfaces. That's how little we know about the virus. The envelopes are then cut open by machine. And if you see workers here, we're in the headquarters for King County, which is like a third of the votes in the state. They're all wearing gloves. Meanwhile, you have the operation. You can see the sorting is happening by machine. This is sort of a third pass that they're doing, but obviously it checks for redundancies. It checks to make sure that the parties are correct and matched up with the voting. And all of this, again, is done with gloves and, very safely. So the health and safety of the worker at this point, because everything is done by mail, is sort of more paramount. And by the talks we've had with election officials, that is like the number one thing they're concerned about. So, so far it's been good. And also, I want to talk about turnout. Just spoke to an election official who said that participation already over 40%. That's huge. This could be a record turnout in the middle of this coronavirus outbreak. So everything's just sort of fell together. Election officials have made good decisions. The party going with the primary. All of these things are working so that people can actually see their democracy in action, and it's not sort of overshadowed by this virus, which obviously everybody is so worried about, Savannah.
Right. That's great to hear, Steve. So, of course, as you mentioned, something like the Iowa caucus, lots of people in a room. Also at the Iowa caucus this year, we had issues with getting that vote count back in time. So I want to talk about this voting process in Washington. What are the methods that the state is using to ensure that every vote is accurately counted? Do you think we're really going to have a winner tonight? When do you think we'll hear?
Yeah, so take a walk with me. First of all, I mean, there's multiple redundancies, right? I've been speaking to election officials. There's the machine, which is huge. There's computers. And I've been told that there's security, both obviously of this building, but also cybersecurity is paramount. So they have multiple redundancies with that. But also, I mean, everything is not only checked by computer, but it's also checked by hand. We were in a room just too long ago. Unfortunately, it's a lunch break right now. It's noon here. But everything that was counted by machine was also counted by hand counted. That process, as you mentioned, is going to take some time. The polls close here at 8 o'clock tonight, our time. But if you're looking at the East Coast, that's 11 o'clock. So results are going to take a while. Not only that, but all the polling that we've seen with Sanders and Biden seems to have it neck to neck. The closer it is, the harder it is to get clear results. So this could take maybe another day, maybe days even. We will get initial partial results by the end of tonight, and we'll be able to report something. But whether it's definitive or not, that remains to be seen. It could be a while before we know.
Absolutely. And Steve, I just want to talk to you also because I know you've been in Washington quite a bit covering coronavirus. Of course, now you're there for the primary as well. But can you just talk to me a little bit about, I know you were up in Kirkland at that nursing home. What's sort of the latest with how people are feeling, how family members there are feeling? What's just the latest on the virus in the state?
It's an incredibly difficult situation, not only at the nursing home, but just across King County. I mean, you can feel the apprehension in the street. You know, in certain places where you've been to Seattle before, where it's quiet, where it shouldn't be, you can feel the tension, you know, even when you're at a restaurant. I will say that a lot of work is being done to make people feel safe. The public safety department, the governor is almost addressing problems daily. The governor just had another press conference today where he announced more precautions and really safety features for workers who may be calling off sick. That is one thing that they're encouraging people to do. If you feel anything, call out of work. Obviously, things like wash your hands, don't touch your face. We've been hearing that for a long time now. But the public safety department simply telling people over 60, pregnant, underlying health conditions to stay away from crowds and even public places. That's something that is being observed, just giving an eyeball on the street. As far as the nursing home, I mean, most of the deaths that we've had in the state have come from this one source. Family members just want information about what's happening, but it's spreading so quickly and it kills so fast that workers are having to keep up. It's a terrible situation, but they're doing their best. Savannah.
It absolutely is. Well, thank you for keeping us updated, Steve. Right now, we're tracking the Mississippi primary with an eye on black women voters. They're a crucial voting bloc that has long been seen as the most consistent in turnout and party loyalty. NBC News correspondent Rahima Ellis is on the ground in Jackson, Mississippi for us. Hey, Rahima, thank you so much for joining us. So what is this key demographic telling you about who they're going to vote for?
Well, the word is that that vote will go for Biden this time around. As you remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the lion's share of the Democratic primary vote here in Mississippi. Bernie Sanders came in at about 16.5%. It's expected again that Biden will take it. Sanders hasn't spent a lot of time here in Mississippi. Essentially, it seems like he's conceded that vote, if you will, to Biden. As you talk about in 2016, 7 in 10 Democratic primary voters in Mississippi were black, and black women made up almost half of the state's Democratic Party electorate. A powerful voting bloc. One woman we talked to here earlier, she said that she was voting for Biden. She hadn't made up her mind until just the last few days. It was a consideration between, of course, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And finally, it came down to Biden for her. A gentleman I spoke to here also had the same kind of thing that he was saying. In fact, he said they have conversations with their family. They get on the phone and they talk about who they're going to vote for. And they went back and forth on the pros and cons, and they finally decided as a family that they're voting for Biden. But again, as you point out, black women are expected to be a critical bloc for voters tonight, and particularly voting for Joe Biden. And we'll see if they help Biden carry more of the South, just like he did during Super Tuesday.
Absolutely. It's interesting to hear you say that Bernie Sanders has basically conceded it to Joe Biden. It does feel like that in a lot of ways. Now, during the competitive 2019 midterms, African-American turnout in Mississippi was weaker than expected. I know it's a little early to determine turnout, but is there a feeling of enthusiasm there that people do want to go vote today?
We have to wait and see. Certainly people coming here are enthusiastic about it. You know, one of the things that's happening here, you don't have early voting in the primary here in Mississippi, but of course, people can vote by absentee ballot. Those ballots had to be turned in by yesterday. So we have yet to see exactly what this turnout is going to be. It has not been heavy here at this polling location, but it has been steady. Those poll watchers here inside, they tell us that they think that around the time that people get off from work, we'll see more activity here, because right now people are at work, and in the morning they just put their energy on getting to work, and maybe they'll put some energy on getting here to this polling place after the work hours. We'll see. But there is some enthusiasm here. People want to see what's going to happen in the final analysis of all of it. And as you're asking and we're watching, to see exactly how that vote comes down as far as who black women are voting for. It's been a very powerful block of voters here in the Mississippi area and consistently throughout the South.
Definitely. Now, there are also some interesting down-ballot races to watch in Jackson today. Who should we be keeping our eye on?
One big one, and that is Mike Espy. You know that he ran for that Senate seat that was vacated by Thad Cochran back in 2018. It was very close. It ended up in a runoff election, and he now that there was just that Senate seat was being filled for just a short time. That was 2 years. Now they're back at it, and he wants to try to be the one that can take that seat. He's got two opponents in this Democratic primary. It's expected that Espy is going to do well and become the Democratic contender. Again, we'll have to see what the voters have to say about all of that. We'll know, I think, pretty early on, once the polls close, whether or not Espy has been victorious tonight and will end up once again running again for that Senate seat come November.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rahima, for keeping an eye on these important races for us. The Dow surged more than 1,100 points in late trading, making up some of the losses from yesterday's historic sell-off. David Gura is with me from the New York Stock Exchange. David, there's obviously a lot to talk about that's going on down there. So yesterday we have this emergency switch shut off, and then we started positive, sinks again. Now we're back up. What's going on? What do we attribute this rebound to?
Yeah, yesterday was a crazy day, to be sure. You saw where markets ended up yesterday, losses we hadn't seen since 2008. So what happened here is investors took a pause, took a deep breath overnight. This morning, we saw markets really rise when the day got started, and then there was this sort of pervasive uncertainty about the health of the markets throughout the day. So there wasn't a whole lot of what's called conviction in the market today. Saw it go up and down, up and down. The president spoke right around lunchtime. The Dow began to drop around that point in time as he spoke with healthcare executives vaguely about what some plans might be, rose here at the end of the day. So folks generally feeling like maybe it was a bit oversold yesterday, fell more than it needed to, but it's that sense there might be more certainty to come. Seeing the president go up to Capitol Hill, talk in slightly more concrete terms about what plans he and the Congress have that gave him some reason for hope.
Well, that is good to hear. So, as you're saying, the president keeps talking about lowering interest rates. What more can the Fed do?
So the Fed's hands are kind of tied here. They've lowered rates a lot. Last week, just a week ago from today, the Fed did this emergency rate cut of 0.5 basis point. And that's something that was pretty extraordinary, done after a meeting with other finance leaders from around the world. And so they've pushed interest rates pretty low. There's a lot of talk about the Fed's toolkit, what it has at its disposal. A lot of that has to do with being able to raise and lower interest rates. And now they are pretty low at this point. So there are things that it can do. There's a meeting coming up next week when it's likely to cut rates once again. But there's been a lot of focus, at least on the president's part, on that, on monetary policy, on interest rates. The conversation seems to be drifting more toward fiscal policy. That is what the Congress, what the administration can do to help consumers who might be in dire straits here as this virus continues to spread.
Now, let's talk oil. So that also rebounded today after a total bloodbath yesterday. But why is that considered good news? I think from a consumer perspective, a lot of times it just seems like it's good for gas to be cheap.
What's so fascinating here is there is, and rightly so much focus, Savannah, on the coronavirus, the uncertainty surrounding all of that. But there are other externalities in the global economy that are still hugely important to investors. The election is one thing, having a primary today, and then the oil market. And over the weekend, we saw a price war break out between Russia and Saudi Arabia. For a long time, just to explain this in kind of simple terms, countries around the world had sort of worked together to keep prices at a pretty stable point, keeping an eye on the United States, which has incredibly cheap oil now because of all the drilling that we've seen here, all the shale drilling that we've seen here in the U.S. This weekend, we saw those two sides sort of say, forget it, we're going to produce more oil, we're going to drag prices down just a little bit. That's worrisome to those who watch the oil market. I'm looking at the board here now. WTI, West Texas Intermediate Oil, is up a little bit today, but $34 a barrel is still way less than what it was. And oil's important, Savannah, for two reasons. One is it gives you a sense of the health of the global economy, and seeing it lower isn't really a great sign. The other thing is it's tied into credit. It's tied into bonds and lending. And yes, the United States is now producing so much oil, but they've been able to do that because they've taken out loans and they've sold bonds. And the cheaper oil gets, the more worry it creates among those who've lent out that money, worried they're not going to get their investment back.
So as you said, not a lot of conviction in the market yesterday, but we're hearing more stable things from the president. Is this sort of why we're getting this advice to not just panic when the market's selling off so hard? If you're in it for the long term, it's hard to time a volatile market?
Far be it from me to offer investment advice, but that is always the soundest advice that you hear over and over and over again. It's best to take a long-term perspective. And that urge to stay calm is something that we've heard from investors, we've heard from lawmakers, we've heard from policymakers as well. So, yes, I think that is the best guidance. And I will say over these last 24 hours, you have seen lawmakers and policymakers doing all of the right things. They're having these meetings. They're being public about what's going on. They're talking about policy proposals that could have an impact here. There was a huge meeting today of the regulators from this country, from all branches of regulators, with the President of the United States. So at least those meetings are taking place. And the fact that they're checking the right boxes is something that engenders a lot more optimism in the health of the economy vis-a-vis what they're doing economically.
Definitely. Hopefully more optimism to come. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, Savannah.
Tonight, the race is down to the top 2 candidates. With contests in 6 states, will a clear frontrunner emerge? NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Casey Hunt and our road warriors bring you all the results. Special coverage begins tonight at 8 Eastern on NBC News Now.
White terrorism and white supremacist terrorism in this country is not some weird analog to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It's not some foreign thing that looks like something that we've been fighting in the war on terror. It's actually fundamentally as American as anything. And it is an existential threat to the multiracial, and pluralistic, equal, and open democracy that we've been fighting for in this country since people died on the battlefield in the Civil War.
Hey everybody, Steve Kornacki back here at the big board.
It's more than numbers.
These are the states that are going to winnow the field. They're probably going to create a front runner.
It's what those numbers mean.
Ideologically, you're seeing in this first wave a very similar electorate to what you saw in 2016. But age-wise, this is the big variable.
This is why we don't allow Steve Kornacki to leave the building this time of year.
Nobody breaks it down like Kornacki.
Need your true crime fix on the go? Dateline episodes are available as podcasts. Mysteries with a twist from the True Crime Original. Wow. Listen to Dateline wherever you get your podcasts.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news. This is all I've got left.
Who brought more to the caucuses?
It's news made for your streaming world. Live weekdays, 3 to 11 p.m. Eastern.
Something new from Meet the Press, the Chuck Toddcast. An insider's take on politics and more with some of my favorite reporters. Get it for free wherever you get your podcasts.
We've got this fundamental thing about human beings, and we've got the way that we constitute our politics. And the danger is that if our politics grow too tribal, they grow excessively tribal, then we'll lose this sort of way of talking.
Why is this happening? With Chris Hayes. Subscribe now.
From Las Vegas, Manchester, from Washington. Why should your judgment be valued?
I'd stake my judgment against anyone out there.
Is party unity your concern right now, or is simply winning as many states as you can?
Well, it's both. NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
We get to have our very own Today Family Getaway.
It's so exciting to be here.
We are serving up a Today Cafe special.
Universal Orlando Resort is the place. We have just loved seeing your beautiful shining faces.
How sweet is that?
A week after Joe Biden's Super Tuesday surge, voters in 6 states are at the polls. The Biden camp has its eyes set on Mississippi, where more than 70% of primary voters in the state are African American, a voting bloc that Biden has had great success with, especially in the South. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander is on the ground in Jackson, Mississippi. Hey, Blaine. So what are Mississippi voters telling you about who they're choosing and how they're coming to that decision?
Yeah, so we're actually at one of the more busy polling places here in Jackson. We've been standing here talking to voters as they've been coming out for the better part of the day. And overwhelmingly, they're telling me that they're going for Joe Biden. Now, I have talked with some Bernie Sanders supporters, but yes, the vast majority have said that they're going for Biden. Now, Savannah, this really is not much of a surprise, and I'll tell you why. You look at one factor here in Mississippi, and of course, that's the African-American vote. In fact, 71% of voters here in Mississippi are African-American. And I don't have to remind you how well Joe Biden has done with black voters, especially black voters in the South. In fact, the demographic here is higher even than we saw in South Carolina when it comes to black voters. So that's something that we expected to see. We expected to see him doing well here in Mississippi, and it certainly seems that that's carrying over. Now, as for reasoning, it's interesting because we've heard a lot about electability. Who is going to be the candidate that will go forward, win the nomination, and for Democrats, ultimately defeat Donald Trump in November? Well, yeah, people here have told me that that's important to them, but they've also said that it goes beyond that. They want somebody who has a plan, and not just a plan for in general, but a plan specifically geared toward African Americans. Just a little bit about Mississippi. This is one of the states here in the country, the state with one of the highest poverty levels, the highest levels of inequality when it comes to access to health care, to education. So people here are looking for certainly a bit more depth than just somebody who can win in November, as of the people that I've talked to, Savannah.
Absolutely. Earlier, I was talking to our colleague, Rahima Ellis, who's also in Mississippi, who kind of said that it almost feels like as if Senator Sanders has sort of conceded to Biden. And Senator Sanders did cancel events that he had in Mississippi instead to go be campaigning in Michigan. How are voters there reacting to that decision?
So here's what's interesting about that. You know, Bernie Sanders does not, historically, the numbers have not been kind to him in Mississippi. If we go back 4 years and look at 2016, when he was up against Hillary Clinton here in Mississippi, he only won about 16% of the vote versus the former Secretary of State. He did not win a single county here in Mississippi. So even just coming into this, he was already certainly not looking at like he was going to be favored. But after Super Tuesday, after we saw those numbers, after we saw how African-American voters across the South, really across Super Tuesday states, turned out for Joe Biden, it looked like he essentially decided where are his resources going to be best used. And as you saw, he canceled that rally here, moved up to Michigan. So what is interesting about this, however, is despite his bad showing back in 2016, the mayor of Jackson actually had endorsed Bernie Sanders. So there was a town hall that was held here, kind of a forum. He listened to some of the younger voters and decided to endorse Bernie Sanders. And at least one person that I've talked to said that it does matter a lot to know how her mayor is planning to vote. So the question is, would that have made a difference? Might that have made a difference? Well, even given that, it appears that canceling the rally moved his resources to Michigan, and people here took notice.
Thank you so much for reporting all that out for us, Blaine. We're learning a little more about what voters are saying matters to them. To break down today's exit polls, we're bringing in NBC News national political reporter Steve Kornacki.
Voting still going on in these states, but we're getting our first look here at what the electorate looks like today in some of these big primaries. So take you through some of the things we're finding. First of all here, take a look. This is Mississippi, one of the states up tonight. You see here in the exit poll just what the electorate looks like. In Mississippi, almost 2/3 black, according to this exit poll. That is the biggest number we have seen yet in any state that's voted. In South Carolina, the previous high, the number was 57. It's 64% here in Mississippi. Of course, we've seen the struggles that Bernie Sanders has had in building support with black voters. We saw earlier this week he had that event in Mississippi that he canceled to go up and campaign in Michigan. So you see the number here in Mississippi. This has, we've seen in other places, spelled trouble for Sanders. We will see what that means as the results come in tonight. Two other big states voting tonight. Missouri, here at 17% black is the electorate here. Again, this was actually the closest state in the 2016 primary. Sanders versus Clinton. He lost to Clinton by about 1,500 votes here, 17% black. And if you take a look in Michigan here, the electorate 18% black. Notably, Michigan in 2016, it had the highest share of black voters of any state that Sanders won. This number was actually 21% in 2016. Remember, Sanders won Michigan narrowly. There is no state in 2016 that had a higher concentration of black voters that Bernie Sanders was able to win in. So we'll keep an eye on that tonight. And the other divide we're going to keep an eye on here demographically, this is among the white voters in these states, Missouri, Michigan in particular, that non-college, college divide. One of the key ingredients for Sanders in being able to win states and be competitive with Hillary Clinton through the primary season in 2016. It was strong support. Boy, Green was not a good choice here. It was strong support from non-college white voters. See a big chunk of the electorate. This is Missouri you're looking at here. Also, you look in Michigan, 37% of the electorate there, non-college white. Sanders was winning this group by double digits against Hillary Clinton last time around. We're going to be keeping a close eye, Ari, as these numbers come in. Is he able to do that again, or has there been some slippage?
Kent County, Michigan, home of Grand Rapids, is a swing district, and its moderate voters could be a major factor in who wins the state. MSNBC correspondent Garrett Hake is with me from Grand Rapids. Hi, Garrett. So, of course, lots of eyes are on Michigan and its many delegates. What are you hearing on the ground there right now?
Well, Savannah, as you said, this is a county that has become more of a swing county over time. It's typically a Republican stronghold. It's the home of President Gerald Ford. But it's moved, while it voted for Barack Obama in 2008, it swung hard towards Mitt Romney in 2012, then started to move back towards Democrats last cycle. So you do see a mix of more moderate voters here, a lot of white working class voters here. In terms of the primary, this is a place that went heavily for Bernie Sanders in 2016. He doubled up Hillary Clinton in this district. And just anecdotally, from my conversations with voters all day long today, it does seem like Sanders has retained a lot of his support here, as is often the case in polling places. And when I talk to voters, I don't meet a ton of new Bernie Sanders supporters, but a lot of folks who were committed to him in 2016 remain committed to him here again. He's going to need big turnout from places like this tonight if he's going to hold off Joe Biden, who's expected to have big numbers in cities like Detroit, potentially in Flint could be a battleground. So you can think of this in the western part of the mitten here as pretty heavy Bernie Sanders country potentially tonight.
Garrett, I was talking to our colleague Dasha Burns earlier, who's also in Michigan, and she also pointed out how many of the voters point to the fact that it was the state of Gerald Ford. I love how proud people in Michigan are of that fact. So now Bernie Sanders won Michigan narrowly in the 2016 primary, even though he went into it with Hillary Clinton above in those polls. Then he beats Hillary Clinton in the general. Do voters have the enthusiasm about Bernie now that they did in 2016? He's going in with Biden having this lead in polls, but maybe that doesn't matter?
It's really hard to tell. I was at a Bernie Sanders rally on Sunday here in Grand Rapids with something like 8,000 people at an outdoor event. Those folks certainly seemed enthused for Bernie Sanders. But just like in 2016, the polls are showing a different candidate with a significant lead here. It's Joe Biden who's leading in the polls here by double digits, sometimes as much as 20 points. You know, expectations can be so finicky in politics because he won last time, because he came back from the political dead last time. It's a lot of folks, Bernie Sanders supporters in particular, who think he can do so again. But it also raises the stakes if he doesn't, right? I mean, this is a state that he won in 2016. If he performs weaker here as we head into these other Midwestern battlegrounds that'll vote in the coming weeks, that could be really damaging for him. So we are seeing enthusiasm, at least in terms of the rallies, whether we can have enough voters who continue to come out and pump up those numbers again, as I said, particularly in the western part of the state, to balance out how well Joe Biden's expected to do in Detroit. You know, that'll be the story throughout the course of this night.
Certainly will be. We'll have to wait and see. Now, let's talk about where you are, Kent County, Grand Rapids specifically. Why is this district so important to the Democratic primary tonight? What's unique about voters there?
The voters here are emblematic of the types of voters that Democrats are trying to win back, particularly across the rest of the upper Midwest. These are union voters. They're blue-collar folks. These are the kind of people whose union boss might have endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016, but who instead chose to vote for Donald Trump. Remember, Michigan was a state that the president won by only about 11,000 votes, the closest state in the country. There are a lot of folks who were willing to give Donald Trump a test drive. Maybe they didn't like Hillary Clinton as the nominee. Well, those are the folks who are very much the target of the Democratic Party this time around. And both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden make a claim to those kinds of voters. Bernie Sanders, you know, has his sort of kind of workers' revolution concept that appeals to a lot of these workers. Medicare for all appeals to a lot of these workers. But Joe Biden is somebody who's had connections with union workers for a very long time, going back to, you know, the firefighters unions that endorsed him when he was running for Senate in Delaware. So that is going to be a major fight in this primary, and the winner hopes to take those voters with them into November.
All right, Garrett, thanks so much for joining us on what is sure to be a busy night.
Good evening from Washington. I'm Casey Hunt. As our good friend Chuck Todd likes to say, cue the election music. We are 5 minutes away from polls closing on what could be a pivotal Tuesday night. We're watching Michigan, Mississippi, and Missouri very carefully. Also on the map tonight, North Dakota, Idaho, and Washington State. Believe it or not, it was just 1 week ago we saw the momentum in this race swing wildly, with Joe Biden streaking ahead in total delegates after Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar assessed the reality in front of them and got behind the former vice president. And this week, Cory Booker and Kamala Harris joining them in backing Biden over Sanders. The other plot twist tonight, the intersection of our election season with the sudden spread of coronavirus. Tonight, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden both canceling rallies in Cleveland, Ohio out of an abundance of caution. The former vice president set to speak at 9 p.m. from Philadelphia. Also tonight, the DNC announcing the live audience. There will be no live audience for the upcoming debate in Arizona. We have reporters fanned out across the states that are voting today. Here with me to discuss all of this, NBC News senior political editor Mark Murray, NBC News political editor Carrie Dan, MSNBC contributor Shauna Thomas, and joining from New York, senior politics editor for NBC News Beth Fooey, and MoveOn.org chief public affairs officer and MSNBC contributor Karine Jean-Pierre. It is great to have all of you tonight on this, what could be a pivotal night for especially Bernie Sanders, because everything is on the line for him here in Michigan. Mark, this was a huge upset for him in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, and they have really put everything on the line there. But it's not, at least in the days running up to this, it has not felt like this is necessarily going to break his way.
Best news for Bernie Sanders is this could be deja vu for him all over again. That the polls, the momentum seems against him, and he's able to shock the political world once again and maybe end up getting that lifeline to next week's contest in Florida and Arizona, and then the following week in Georgia. All really tough political terrain for Bernie Sanders. But Casey, on the other hand, if somehow Joe Biden's able to win Michigan, do better than expected in places like Washington State, this could be very tough and really almost cement the narrative that Bernie Sanders is right now is running a weaker campaign in 2020 than he was in 2016.
So, Carrie, what are you seeing in some of our early exit polling data that has been coming in here that you think is worth watching at this hour tonight?
One thing I think is worth watching in both Missouri and Michigan is how Bernie Sanders does with white voters, particularly white voters who do not have a college degree. That was his big strength in Michigan in 2016. Union voters were some of his big strengths. I want to see if he's doing as well with those constituencies versus Joe Biden as he did versus versus Hillary Clinton. You remember Hillary Clinton's pitch compared to Joe Biden? Yeah. Joe Biden now throughout his career has talked about people who need a hand up, people who view their job as a source of great pride. He has tried to be average Joe. I understand union workers. I want to see if Joe Biden's appeal to those voters is making a difference or whether they're sticking with Bernie Sanders like they did 4 years ago.
Well, and Shauna, I mean, all of that sort of raises the question with me, especially in places like Michigan, if Bernie Sanders does in fact lose to Joe Biden, were those results in 2016 really just about people who didn't like Hillary Clinton?
I mean, I think that is one of the biggest questions of 2016 is did she also lose the entire election because people just had all this baggage about the Clintons, and 1,000 books have been written about it, and it'll be interesting to see how he does. But I also think the narrative that'll come out of this, if Joe Biden runs away as we expect him to with Mississippi, mostly because of black voters, depending on how many black voters vote in Michigan, then the narrative will still be, even if Bernie Sanders performs well in Michigan, even if he takes the North Dakota caucus, can he win with black voters, which is what you need to win the Democratic primary. And it's hard to see how any of these narratives cancel that out.
Right. Well, I mean, and we've gotten enough information, I think, already to realize that Bernie Sanders, who has really struggled with black voters all the way along, has not made the inroads necessary to actually make a big difference here. But we are ready. It is now 8 o'clock in the East, so polls have closed in some of these critical states we are covering tonight. And right now at 8 p.m., NBC News can project that Joe Biden is going to win in Mississippi. That is the state we were just talking about. These are those critical African-American voters. They make up an enormous share of the electorate in Mississippi, and they are on track to hand Joe Biden a win in that southern state. Also closing now at 8 p.m., the polls in Missouri. And at this hour, that race, according to NBC News, is too early to call. We are not ready to call the Missouri primary quite yet. We are watching for the vote to start coming in there. But that, of course, a critical piece of the map tonight, a place where, as Carrie Dan was just kind of walking us through, you had some areas where Sanders performed relatively well. We're looking to see if he does as well or if he falters a little bit with some of those critical demographics. I think we have Ali Vitale, one of our NBC News road warriors, out on the trail for us, ready to talk to us. Ali, you are, I believe, in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where both of these candidates were supposed to be campaigning and speaking, looking ahead to next Tuesday's contests. Of course, both of them have decided because of state health recommendations, they will not hold their rallies there tonight. But walk us through what you know, what you've seen as you've been talking to voters and what this call in Mississippi means for this race.
Yeah, Casey, tonight was supposed to be one of those rare nights where you had multiple road warriors in the same place because both Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders were supposed to be here in Cleveland, both of them canceling their rallies. And I think today sort of presents a twofold piece of what this 2020 election is going into. On the politics front, calling Mississippi early for the Biden campaign, that sort of tracks with the level of confidence that they had as they looked at the southern states who were voting today. At the same time, they are managing expectations as far as Michigan goes. They know that this is one of those states that was critical for Bernie Sanders in 2016 and could also prove critical for the Biden campaign if they're able to sort of continue this self-fulfilling prophecy, this narrative that they've been able to build around themselves since South Carolina, that the party is falling in line behind Joe Biden. Even just think of the way that he ended his campaign in Michigan just yesterday when he was out on the road with Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, a show of force, shock and awe for not just Michigan voters, but at the same time, voters across the country. And then, of course, the coronavirus piece of this, canceled rallies here. Joe Biden also now announcing that he's canceling a Tampa event that he was supposed to do on Thursday and instead giving an address from Wilmington, Delaware on the coronavirus. This is just one of those moments where you start to realize that another unforeseen force. First, it was impeachment, forcing them to contend with how they could campaign when senators were supposed to be in Washington. Now it's a question of how do you campaign at all face-to-face when this public health crisis is looming over this entire race. Tonight was the first time that we saw campaigns have to contend with that and actually cancel rallies. But this could very much be the new reality going forward as we go into this campaign 2020 season, into this next phase, Super Tuesday 2.0 and beyond.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. It'd be a pretty stunning turn of events and something that certainly we've never seen in modern times. Ali Vitale, thank you very much, my friend. Always great to see you. We're going to go now to our Rahema Ellis, who is on the ground in Mississippi. African-American voters just really running up the score there for Joe Biden. And this electorate, it looks like a little bit less heavily African-American this time around, 64% in 2020 versus 71% in 2016. Rahema, what have you learned on the ground there today?
What we heard is what you've just been talking about, that African Americans, it seems, helped bring Joe Biden over the top if what you're projecting holds true, and that if you're saying that Biden looks like he's going to win the primary here in Mississippi. If it again holds true, that projection, it means that Biden would have done a sweep of the South. It seems like a lot of people figured that Bernie Sanders was thinking that, and they didn't see him down here in Mississippi. They thought that he had essentially conceded this state to Joe Biden. You know, in 2016, what happened down here in terms of the primary was that the 2016 results were that Hillary Clinton got over 80% of the vote down here, and Bernie Sanders got only in the teens, something like 16%. And black women essentially in this state make up almost half of the state's electorate, a powerful voting bloc. When we talk to people down here, black women, they said things like, yes, we are nurturers. Yes, we come out to vote. Yes, we are thinking about the future. And so it's critical for us to do that. And the other thing that I asked them is about whether or not they were enthusiastic about their candidate, or was this just the last of the last? People said, no, they are enthusiastic. And what were they thinking? They're thinking that there's a need for change from what's happening in the White House now. They hope that Joe Biden will be the person who brings people together versus what they say is being done by the man in the White House now. They say he is dividing the nation, and they want someone who can bring everyone together via the next election. So that's what they were voting for this time. I've got to show you one thing, however. In this ballot, Casey, there are 10 names on the ballot. One woman said to me she was a little upset about that. She said, what if people think that their candidate is still on the ballot when it still is just a three-person race because Gabbard is in here, but it's between Biden and Sanders. So there's a little commercial up in New York that used to talk about an educated consumer was the best customer. Well, an educated consumer is also the best electorate in this particular instance. They didn't have time to rewrite the ballots for the election, but based on what you're telling me, it may not have made a difference.
Rahema Ellis, thank you so much for your reporting from Mississippi, which, of course, NBC has now projected will go for Joe Biden in this primary. We're going to go now, though, to another state we are watching. NBC News now projecting that both Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden will hit threshold in Missouri. Not a surprise, because obviously it is essentially a head-to-head contest. Tulsi Gabbard, of course, still running, but we are still counting those votes, looking at our results. Too early to call in Missouri, but we do find our Vaughn Hilliard on the ground there in Florissant, Missouri. Vaughn, what has been, this has been a contest. Bernie Sanders was campaigning in St. Louis earlier this week. What's your sense of how things are potentially going to shake out based on what you've heard on the ground?
Exactly, Casey. Joe Biden was here on Saturday. Then you're right. Bernie Sanders was just here about 30 hours ago in downtown St. Louis. And when you're looking at this race, for as much attention as Michigan and Mississippi are getting, when you're looking at Missouri, go back 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders here by just about 1,600 votes. And of course, Bernie Sanders is in this race again. And so when you're looking at these numbers 4 years ago to today, I think that's where these numbers are going to be able to tell us a lot. Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton by 19 percentage points in the general election here. And you don't hear many folks suggesting that a Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders could potentially win against Donald Trump this November. But when you're looking at what type of candidate is able to draw these various demographics to best build this idea of the Obama coalition, I think that's where these numbers that are just starting to come in will tell us. We are in St. Louis County, which is about 50% African American. And so what you have seen as evidence is that Joe Biden, based off of some of these early entrance polling numbers, got about 69%, at least according to our entrance polling, among African-American voters. But also, we're getting these numbers in, and again, these are just exit polling figures, not the actual results. But exit polling from NBC News is suggesting that here in Missouri, about 54% of white voters went for Joe Biden compared to 38% for Bernie Sanders. Of course, that would suggest that Joe Biden has grown his support over what Hillary Clinton was able to do here from 4 years ago. In large part, these primaries that have taken place to date, Casey, have shown that Joe Biden has been able to gain support among more of the non-highly educated white voters, those working class voters that were more deferential to Bernie Sanders 4 years ago. These early numbers at least suggest that could be the case again here in Missouri. The other issue is looking even beyond here in urban St. Louis, but looking more towards places like Jefferson County. This is more of those St. Louis suburbs there, where it's independents and Republicans who didn't have a primary to take part in this time around. But how many of those folks, more moderate individuals that perhaps even voted for the likes of Claire McCaskill in the past or a Jason Kander back in 2016, were willing to support a Joe Biden candidacy? I think that's why we'll go back to that number from 4 years ago. Hillary Clinton with just a 1,600 vote victory over Bernie Sanders. And will they both meet thresholds apparently statewide? To what extent would Joe Biden be able to expand that support and really make the case that he is the candidate that could roll into a place like Missouri and pick off some of these more working class white voters and be able to carry that message at the very same time he's able to say, I also have only grown my support among African-American voters? Casey?
That question of African-American turnout is one I'm really interested in, whether, depressed turnout among black voters back in 2016 obviously seemed to have hurt Hillary Clinton, whether it would make a difference for Joe Biden if he were, in fact, to win this primary and face Trump in the general election. Vaughn Hilliard, thank you very much. Yes. Let's go now to Karine Jean-Pierre in New York. Karine, I just want to pick up on some of these threads that we've been talking about here. We've got some of these numbers out of Mississippi now. Black voters, 84%. For Joe Biden in the state of Mississippi. It's very close to the number of voters who also attend religious services weekly, who went 83% for Joe Biden. Same moderates and conservative Democrats, 84%. Older people, age over 45, 86%. Yeah. Just absolutely cleaning up with those voters. And, I feel like you and I probably had this conversation on TV before these voters started voting, but African-American women, the core constituency of this Democratic Party. And if you can't win them, it's really tough to win the nomination, which Bernie Sanders is learning the hard way.
Yeah, I will say this over and over again on TV, which is if you are a Democratic candidate and you want to get the nomination, you have to get overwhelming support from African-American voters, in particular black women. And if you want to win in the general election, the same thing. You have to have that key demographic to help you get over to that line there. So here's the thing. You guys earlier were talking about what 2016 was about. I can tell you what 2020 is about. 2020 is about Donald Trump. This is what we're seeing. It's about Donald Trump getting him out of office. And we see this over and over when it comes to Joe Biden's momentum, right? The Joe-mentum, as they're talking about it. That's what's taking him over the line. That's what is helping him get these big, huge numbers with black voters, especially in the South. So we expected this. We expected him to do well in Mississippi, especially after how well he did in South Carolina and a week ago in southern states. So this is not that surprising, but it is now his coalition. This is it. Black voters. We also saw some interesting numbers for him in the suburban areas, older voters. Like this is kind of becoming Biden's coalition. So now Bernie needed to do well with black voters, with older voters in order to just compete, in particular in Michigan, because we knew Mississippi and Missouri was going to probably go Biden's way, but Michigan is the game right now, and we're going to, I guess, get to see how Bernie does in that state pretty soon.
We are of course waiting on the polls to close in Michigan. It's a split poll close state, so we'll see if we get some more information coming up at 9 o'clock. We had been hearing that there were some potential problems counting the ballots in Michigan. So that's a big question mark for us tonight. Is that absolutely a critical state? And Beth Fooey, let's stick with that question of how we may see things shake out. I mean, we've used Macomb County, for example, as essentially a litmus test for every election going back, to Reagan at the very least, those voters that have been, white, working class, a lot of them members of auto unions. They've swung back and forth. Many of them voted for Obama, but then they swung over to Trump. What have you seen so far tonight as we've been talking through this about what will we potentially learn about Joe Biden's strength or weaknesses from what comes out of Michigan tonight?
Well, yeah, as you recall, Casey, Bernie Sanders actually beat Hillary Clinton by a very surprising, sort of very narrow margin, but a very big surprise in 2016 because he was polling way behind her right up to the vote. And that's why the Bernie Sanders campaign feels optimistic today, because even though many of the polls have shown him trailing Joe Biden, they are hoping that because of what happened in 2016, that history can perhaps repeat itself this year. But you know what's different, Casey? You're talking about Macomb County. You're talking about those sort of white working class voters, many of whom voted for Obama and then voted for President Trump. They're not really the story this year. The story from 2018 and the story that we've seen so far in 2020 is not that necessarily that group of voters as sort of this big swing voters, but rather suburban voters, suburban women, people who might have sat out 2016 or maybe even voted in the past for Republicans, but now are unhappy with President Trump and want to see a change. They led that change in 2018. They brought forth those 40 Democrats to flip red districts. And that same coalition, as Karine was describing, seems to be coming together around Joe Biden, helping him across the finish line with Bernie Sanders and potentially in November against President Trump. You just see so much example of that. The turnout in most of these states is going much higher than we saw in primaries in 2016. There's a real level of motivation we didn't see in 2016. African-American turnout, which you mentioned before, was a little bit diminished in 2016, appears not to be the case at all this time. So right now, that coalition, that sort of moderate black coalition that brought forth those 40 new Democrats in 2018 seem to be what is powering Joe Biden at this point.
Yeah, no, fair enough. It's an absolutely good point. And I remember being at a lot of these Bernie Sanders rallies in Michigan, and that's where you really heard from the voters who were saying, well, if it's not Bernie, then I'm going to vote for Trump. And so maybe maybe those Macomb County type voters have been lost to the Democrats entirely. Or, I'd be interested to see if Joe Biden wins the nomination, if he can get some of them back. Beth Fooey, stick with us, please. I think we want to go out now to Grand Rapids to continue this conversation about what's happening on the ground. Dasha Burns has been reporting for us from Grand Rapids. Are you learning anything new there about where things stand in terms of the count, in terms of what we're going to hear coming up here as we head toward poll close at 9?
Hey, Casey. Yeah, so we actually just left our polling site right after it closed at 8 o'clock. We were in Grand Rapids Township Precinct 6, and we've made our way to the Grand Rapids Township Clerk's office, where actually all the precincts in this area are going to be walking through these doors any minute and delivering the physical results, the poll book, a big old bag of ballots to this office right behind me, where the receiving board will be actually looking at all of that, doing their due diligence with all of those materials. But we just got the results from Precinct 6, the split poll results. We have Joe Biden leading in the ballot count there with 186 ballots for Joe Biden.
Dasha, I'm so sorry I've got to interrupt
Bernie
you.
Sanders,
We have some breaking news we have to bring to our viewers. I do apologize for interrupting you, but we want to break in because now NBC
Live
News
TV
can project that Joe Biden wins the state of Missouri. He is the projected winner tonight. That is a major prize on the map, 68 delegates at stake in Missouri. Not, of course, the biggest prize tonight. That, of course, is in Michigan, where we were just talking with Dasha Burns. But the projected winner in Missouri, Joe Biden, not necessarily unexpected, but certainly something that it's one less thing to worry about if you're Joe Biden. Let's just put it that way. Josh Letterman, I believe, is with us. Josh Letterman is in Cleveland, Ohio. Josh, you, of course, were supposed to be covering the Bernie Sanders campaign tonight. He is not in Cleveland anymore because of the coronavirus. But so far, this shaping up not to be necessarily a great night for Bernie Sanders, although we're still waiting, of course, for those critical votes out of Michigan.
There's some concerns based on the way this coronavirus is proceeding that if Bernie Sanders is not able to hold these massive rallies like the one that was canceled just behind me here in Cleveland, that's going to particularly affect his brand and style of campaigning differently than someone like Joe Biden, who never really was one for massive rallies, which much more about retail politicking, person to person. But for Bernie Sanders, we're hearing from supporters of his, they're concerned what that's going to do to his campaign. As far as the results coming in tonight. The Sanders campaign knew that some of these states were going to be very difficult for him, even in Michigan, where there was a lot of attention on the fact that he pulled off this upset victory against Hillary Clinton 4 years ago in Michigan. The Sanders campaign has been hopeful, optimistic, pointing out the hard work that he's done in Michigan, but realizing that Hillary Clinton is not Joe Biden, and that the same weaknesses in Hillary Clinton that gave someone like Bernie Sanders an opening against her in Michigan, and frankly, that gave Donald Trump an opening against her in Michigan, are not the same with someone like Joe Biden, who does have a much more proven appeal to a lot of these voter groups that we've been talking about tonight. So we're going to have to see as this moves forward, as we get more and more information tonight, the key thing that the Sanders campaign will be looking at, the delegate count, and whether Joe Biden emerges from this with such a lead in the delegate count that it looks somewhat insurmountable, or whether Sanders is able to keep that to a minimum so that at least he looks like he still has a viable pathway toward the nomination coming out of the 6 states that are voting today. Casey?
All right, Josh Letterman, thank you very much for that. Let's bring you back here to our panel. Guys, we got a lot to chew over really quick. Missouri, Biden's key groups here, people who believe that he can unite the country or believe that the most important thing is somebody who can unite the country. 83% of those people voted for Joe Biden. 69% of black voters voting for Joe Biden. 68% of older voters and 67% of those who wanted somebody who can beat Donald Trump went for Joe Biden. Carrie Dan, put Missouri in context for us and on the broader map. What does this win mean for Biden?
I mean, I think this is going to show that he may have strength elsewhere in the country with those groups that we were talking about earlier, those union workers, those white voters without a college degree. This is a group that Sanders won by, I think, 9 points 4 years ago, union voters. Joe Biden is leading with them by over 20 points in these exit polls that we're looking at. That bodes very well for him. And I do just want to point out the context here. Missouri was extremely hard fought last time. Hillary Clinton barely won it by less than a percentage point. And back in 2008, it was extremely close with Barack Obama just barely winning the state. So, yes, I mean, Biden was assumed to be a frontrunner in the state going into tonight. But the fact that we're calling this at, 8-17 is a pretty good night for Joe Biden.
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult on primary nights because you can't call it a pure swing state. But in the context of a split Democratic Party, it was a swing state of Missouri. Mark, what are you seeing in some of these numbers that you think is worth underscoring tonight?
So we talked about Joe Biden's overperformance. Let's talk about Bernie Sanders' underperformance. And, this talk about I'm going to bring this new electorate out. Yeah. What really strikes me from the exit polls in Missouri is that 12% ended up saying that they were 18 to 29 years old. That is actually down from 2016. It is yet another state in which the electorate is actually older. And, of course, Bernie Sanders says I'm going to bring out, my kind of voters. But we ended up seeing from state to state to state, and Bernie Sanders is underperforming and not really bringing people out. And in fact, when you kind of look through the exit polls, it really is the very liberals, the younger voters, and not a whole lot else. And that is problematic when you get to states that aren't Vermont and get outside of contests that aren't caucuses.
Well, and Shauna, I mean, we've seen on the trail the last couple of days, Bernie Sanders has in some ways blamed young voters for not showing up as part of the reason why he hasn't been doing better. And, of course, the media along with it.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're to blame for everything, if you ask me. But the thing is, Joe Biden is running a campaign, and you can say what you want about his campaign and how it was run between Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina. That is sort of an old school campaign, which is older people go and vote, especially in primaries. And sort of depending your campaign on getting a whole new electorate to come maybe vote for the first time, or maybe the second time, even though we had a lot of young voters not show up in 2016, is a really hard way to win. I also think one of the numbers you pulled out, that it was 67% of people who wanted to beat Trump. That's the Missouri numbers, right?
This is Missouri,
That says that there's something about Bernie Sanders' message that isn't totally resonating with people who that is their key thing. And we've been talking all throughout this primary that beating Trump, whatever electability is, that crazy word electability, that is the key thing everyone is focusing on. There's something that has gotten through that has made people convinced that Bernie Sanders, at least in the case of these particular numbers, is not the one to beat Trump. And I'm curious if it's the down ballot message, if it is just the democratic socialist message, which he is. I'm not trying to bag on Bernie or anything like that.
Well, but look, I mean, let's be real. Those older voters that you're talking about that are so important, I mean, they have a much different perception of democratic socialism.
Or the word socialism in general.
Or the word socialism in general. You know, I mean, and you know, you can even set Florida aside just in terms of age. I mean, younger voters, a lot of them weren't, the youngest voters that are showing up these college towns were not even alive when the Berlin Wall fell down.
Yeah.
Right. So it's
Cold War's not a thing.
It's a completely different set of associations. But I mean, I feel like a lot of these older voters, this is somebody that they feel like they've seen for a long time, the old hippie even, and they don't think that they can win elections.
Yeah. And again, you know, when you end up looking at that Bernie Sanders coalition, you know, to me, Casey, what you kind of end up getting at is this kind of revolution versus restoration. And Shauna was like talking about the electability. And, you know, in fairness to Bernie Sanders, and we've all heard his rallies time, and he says, we have to beat Trump. Trump is a racist. He goes in all of that.
He's really consistent, yeah.
But the fundamental part of his entire message is we can't just get rid of Trump. We actually have to have a revolution in our American politics. Like, replacing Trump isn't enough. And honestly, Joe Biden's message is much different. He's like, no, just replace Trump. And we go back to 2016. And isn't that a nicer, friendlier place? And those are the two messages.
It seems like normalcy is selling at this hour of the night. All right, we have so much coming up. We're going to talk more about how the coronavirus is affecting the election. We are also, of course, watching Michigan. Those polls close across the state by 9 p.m. We are carefully checking in to see what our exit data is showing, the latest there. We're going to break it all down for you as the night unfolds. Stick with us.
Today Family Getaway.
It's so exciting to be here.
We are serving up a Today Cafe special.
Universal Orlando Resort is the place. We have just loved seeing your beautiful shining faces.
How sweet is that?
Need your true crime fix on the go? Dateline episodes are available as podcasts. Mysteries with a twist from the True Crime Original. Wow. Listen to Dateline wherever you get your podcasts.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news. This is all I've got left.
Who brought more to the caucuses?
It's news made for your streaming world. Live weekdays, 3 to 11 p.m. Eastern.
We've got this fundamental thing about human beings, and then we've got the way that we constitute our politics. And the danger is that if our politics grow too tribal, then we'll lose this sort of way of talking.
Why is this happening? With Chris Hayes. Subscribe now.
To live coverage on NBC News Now. Polls in Mississippi and Missouri are closed, and NBC has projected that Joe Biden will win in Missouri and in Mississippi. That's 36 delegates there in Mississippi, more in Missouri, 68 delegates. We are, of course, counting carefully and awarding those as the night goes on. But the state, of course, that we are watching most closely tonight is Michigan. Polls close there. It's a split, what we call a split poll close. So some polls have already closed in Michigan, but we're still waiting on others. And we can't, of course, walk through all of that data for you until we have all of the information at our fingertips. And we're also watching for the Secretary of State. There are some questions about how quickly they're going to count the votes in Michigan tonight. So we're keeping an eye on that to see. We've, of course, already had one giant counting debacle in this primary season so far. So we have all of our fingers crossed we are not running into something like that tonight in Michigan. The other dynamic in play, of course, Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden both canceling their rallies tonight. They were supposed to be in Cleveland, but that is, of course, because of fears around the coronavirus. And that context could reshape this entire campaign, both this primary campaign, but also potentially the general election. The vice president set to speak, that's Joe Biden, not Mike Pence, former vice president, at 9 p.m. from Philadelphia, right as the polls close in Michigan. We do have some early insights from our exit polling, and one of them is a split in priorities between Sanders and Biden voters. Among Biden supporters who voted tonight, 71% prioritized beating Trump, and that's identical to the views that supporters in earlier contests who voted for him had. Among Sanders voters, only 46% prioritized beating Trump. We, of course, are also counting carefully in Missouri tonight. We've, of course, called that race already for Joe Biden, but we do find NBC's Vaughn Hilliard there. He is still at a now closed polling location in Florissant, Missouri. Vaughn, we were talking a little bit at the table about this. Missouri was a nail-biter in 2016 between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. It was close between Obama and Clinton back in 2008. This is a pretty early poll close and a pretty a good sign for Biden's campaign going forward there tonight. Why?
Right before the break there, you guys were breaking down the exit polling there, which shows Joe Biden not only with support among African-American voters, 69% of black voters supporting Joe Biden per NBC exit polling, but also when you look at white voters, overwhelming support by about 20 percentage points over Bernie Sanders. You know, it was 4 years ago that Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders here in Missouri by just 1,600 votes, though. You know, I was talking with Ava and James Victorian earlier. They voted here at the St. Louis location, and they said that they came and voted for Joe Biden today. And they said that they were frustrated because they remembered a time in which Missouri was not forgotten or ignored during the general election. You know, 4 years ago, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton here by 19 percentage points. But just 4 years before that, Barack Obama only lost by 9 percentage points. And of course, Claire McCaskill used to be the sitting U.S. senator, a Democrat here, 4 years ago in the U.S. Senate race. Jason Kander, a Democrat, lost by just 2 percentage points against Republican Roy Blunt. And those two voters I talked to said that they want Missouri to be in play again, and they believe that Joe Biden is that path forward, questioning how Bernie Sanders would ever actually pass what it took to pass the legislation that he's pressed. And I think some of that exit polling broke that down. There was the question in NBC exit polling on who would be best in order to beat Donald Trump. 67% saying Joe Biden. Who is best to unify the country? 83% of voters saying Joe Biden. You know, when you're looking at these numbers, 1,600 votes separated Bernie Sanders from Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. But early evidence, at least from exit polling, would suggest that this is big for Joe Biden. And while he may not, if he were to become the nominee, Casey, be able to beat Donald Trump here in the state next November, at the same time, what this polling evidence shows there, what the exit polls show us, is not only support, greater support among working class white voters, those voters, white voters without college degrees, which Hillary Clinton struggled to garner the same traction among. But also there's that question about about those moderate voters, those independent voters here in the state, Republican voters that didn't have a Republican primary to partake in. To what extent did those folks decide to show up and partake on behalf of Joe Biden? I think that's, as we watch these Missouri results come in, as much as we may be paying attention to the delegate count, I think there's a lot more that we can take away from the demographic breakdown here out of Missouri. Casey?
For sure. Vaughn Hilliard, thank you very much. Always great to see you, my friend. I'm sure we'll be talking to you again as this night wears on. But let's go back to Mississippi and our colleague Rahema Ellis, who has been on the ground reporting there for us. Rahema, one thing that stood out to me as well, and we were talking a little bit here at the table about the reliable, frankly, older voters who come out more typically than the young voters Bernie Sanders campaign is relying on. And, you know, our data coming out of Mississippi shows the electorate there is actually older this time than it was in 2016. 74% of voters were over the age of 45, 26% under 45. That's up 15 points. Only 60% were over 45 back in 2016. That seems to refute this argument that Bernie Sanders is able to juice youth turnout.
It really does. And based on what we saw here at this one particular voting location, there were a large number of older women, maybe certainly in their 30s and over 40, who were coming to this particular place. So that bears out what you're saying about that traditional, reliable vote, that black vote among black women. Black women generally make up the strongest voting bloc here in Mississippi. We talked to some of these voters, men and women, and take a listen to what they had to say about the election today.
Because if we don't come together as a country, as a people, how are we going to lead other nations around us? How are we going to do that if we're divided?
You see a lot of black women come out?
Of course I do, because we're, as black women, we're nurturers. We don't just plan for the day. We plan for tomorrow. And what we do is not only for our children, but our grandchildren. So we're looking for their future as well.
I am a Democratic, and I've always been Democratic, and I watch him, his character, his attitude, and I believe he's an honest citizen. And I believe he'll do what he say as much as he can, or be allowed to, in his ability.
I think the people who know Biden have listened to the message from South Carolina, friend Congressman Clyburn, who's a great friend of Representative Benny Thompson here, and we've heard the message about we know Joe Biden and Joe Biden knows us.
One of the things, Casey, we were hearing over and over again is that people want to bring back unity in this country, and they believe that Joe Biden is a candidate who can do that. People here were saying that they're just tired of the division. They're tired of the kind of comments that are sort of caustic that they're hearing coming out of the White House. They don't want that anymore. They believe that Joe Biden is a candidate who can take all of that negativity out of the White House. They also think that Joe Biden is the one who speaks to their issues. And that's one of the reasons why they said they came into this place today and voted for him. I have to tell you one other thing, too, in terms of the consistency, as we were talking about earlier, that it did seem to be an older group of people voting, but a large number of the people that we saw here were also black women.
Rahema Ellis, thank you very much for that update from Mississippi, which, of course, we have now at this hour, and we called it at the poll close for Joe Biden. My panel's back with me, and we have Maria Teresa Kumar, the CEO of Voto Latino, also with us from New York. And Maria Teresa, we spent a lot of time saying it, and, you know, I realize we're looking forward, not back. But I think it's important to underscore that this race has changed incredibly dramatically when diverse voters got a chance to have their voices heard.
Absolutely. And I think that what you're seeing become their voters.
There we go.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep, we got you now. I'm sorry.
Wonderful. You missed my brilliance, Casey. Shower
us with it again.
I'll try. Second time's not always so good. But no, what I was sharing was that the Democratic Party at this moment has an opportunity to cement a new generation of voters. You'll have 12 million more young voters than baby boomers this election, for the very first time in American history. And what's interesting is that they need to cement every new voter as their voter, as the progressive base. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing enthusiasm. Even if you're looking at some of the returns in Dearborn right now, their election results, they're basically flooding the gates with new voters. They didn't expect it. The Secretary of State there, Benson, basically said that 7,000 people registered on day of. And that talks about the importance of not only modernizing our election system, but making it more accessible for voters to come in and participate.
Carrie Dan, let's pick up on that very point. I mean, it does seem, I mean, we're still waiting on some of our numbers here, and I want to be cautious in terms of what we can say and what we can't say in terms of our exit polling. But certainly, I think we're on safe ground to say this is a good night for Joe Biden if what we've seen out of Missouri and Mississippi, particularly Missouri, holds in terms of demographic trends. Michigan is looking relatively good for Joe Biden.
I think that's totally fair to say. Don't forget that Missouri also has a significant chunk of black voters too. We talked a lot about that with Mississippi. So does the state of Michigan. Black voters are obviously not a monolith, but there is a significant part of the Michigan electorate, particularly around the Detroit area. If Joe Biden is pulling in margins like he's pulling in Missouri and Mississippi with that electorate, that's obviously great news for him. And the fact that he's doing as well with white voters as he is in Missouri is a very good sign for him. One thing I want to talk about in comparison to 2016, we keep on going back to 2016, and it's always my benchmark for how Sanders has to do in comparison to how he did 4 years ago. Yeah. But one thing that's really important to remember is the fact that 4 years ago, Donald Trump was considered unelectable in a general election. Now he's a real reality. So when we talk about voters who make it their top priority to beat Donald Trump, that's not beating a mythical vision of what people think maybe Donald Trump would be like as president. Right. They've experienced it for the last 2.5 years. And I think that's why you're seeing so much concrete decision-making on the part of voters who say, I've lived through this. I maybe made a decision 4 years ago that I'm regretting, but now I'm going to show up. I'm going to turn out. And I'm going to vote for somebody who I think can win.
Well, I want to talk for a second, too, about something that we've mentioned a couple times tonight, that coronavirus is kind of shadowing all of this. It's obviously the big news story. It's what everyone is talking about at home, with their families, with their friends, what a lot of us are talking about, before we came on the air. It's affected the candidates' decisions to cancellations. But, Shauna, the idea that we're potentially settling in for months, weeks, if not months, of changing lifestyle, of fighting a crisis, of unpredictable situations where suddenly what the federal government does is very important to a lot of people's lives in a way that it isn't necessarily when there isn't a crisis at hand. How does that shape up when, it's just struck me that for Donald Trump, this is perhaps the worst problem he could face, because everyone is tuned in way past his own base of supporters. He's got to talk to literally the entire country, and he's developed a reputation for not telling the truth. So at a time when he most needs Americans to trust him, they don't know if they can. And in the context of trying to run for re-election, that is a tough hill to climb.
It's an incredibly hard hill to climb. I do think, and if you'll allow me to be purely political and step away from the fact that the coronavirus is affecting real people, it is like killing people, that kind of thing, purely political, Donald Trump had an opportunity here, actually. This is a really hard thing to do, to try to rally this country and figure out what to do about a pandemic. There are organizations that prepare for this, but you can never really actually prepare. But if he had a little bit more, especially with a lot of voters, if people believed a little bit more about what he said, if he put the scientists front and center, and if he didn't try to downplay this too much and didn't contradict them, there is a way to look presidential. And I know we are really scared of using that term. And after every State of the Union night, we're like, did he look presidential? I don't know. But there was a way to look presidential and in control of this country when, and a lot of people have said this on MSNBC, when everyone thinks that this is what the federal government is supposed to do. And whether you are a conservative who thinks we should have smaller government, or a Democrat like Bernie Sanders who thinks the government should be in control of all of your health care, you have the ability here to step up to the plate and be like, hey, guys, I'm president. And it kind of goes to what you were saying, that, Donald Trump was sort of a mythical idea of what presidential might be in 2016. He is actually the president now. And in this case, he is creating a situation where he is running against himself. And there is a way for Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden to, and this is going to make me sound crass, and I get it, capitalize upon that he is not necessarily the most stable genius in the world to be running when you are worried about your family and your friends and your grandparents possibly dying from something.
Yeah. Well, we have numbers, I think, on, who people would trust in a crisis. And a lot of voters are saying that, Joe Biden, they're telling us that Joe Biden is that person, and Biden is going to deliver remarks tomorrow. We've learned in Wilmington Delaware about coronavirus. That is instead of a previously scheduled campaign event that he had in Tampa, Florida. Karine Jean-Pierre, can you weigh in on this for us? I mean, how are you thinking about this as an overarching problem? I mean, underscoring what Shauna's excellent point and caveat. Yes. I mean, this is not a strictly political conversation, but it is one where the stakes are very high, and people are going to be deciding who to vote for based on actions and words.
Yeah, so I want to just state that Donald Trump has had crisis before. If you think about the separation of children from their families at the border, but it only affected people at the border, unfortunately. Now we are at a point where this crisis is, something that was not part policy or something that he created. It's something that's completely out of his control. And so now he does what he does best, which is he blames everyone else and doesn't know how to be a leader. And this is not all that surprising. We've seen Donald Trump do this over and over again, lie about things and blame it on everyone else. And it's almost as if it's like he doesn't care about the public, the health of the public. He cares about the health of his political gain. So he is thinking about politics, but he's just thinking about it in a different way. He's thinking about the economy and making sure the economy doesn't tank. And what he doesn't understand is the public is looking to him for this moment. So when you look at those numbers for Biden and how high they are and how people trust him and could lead, a lot of that is because he was vice president. He was in the White House. He was in the Oval Office. He dealt with Ebola as being one of the point people for the Obama administration. So people see him in that role. And so it actually helps Biden in that way if you're thinking about the politics of all of this. And I want to be clear, it's not that people don't like Bernie Sanders, because if you look at his favorability at all of the polls, he actually did better than all of the other candidates. People are just making a choice. They're making a choice on who could beat Donald Trump, on the unifying the country, on getting out of this kind of hole that folks feel that they're in, getting us out of this and into a forward-moving motion.
Yeah, no, great points all. Karine, thank you. Let's press pause on this coronavirus conversation for just a second, because it is 8:45. We're 15 minutes away from the final poll close at 9 p.m. In Michigan. We are also expecting a news conference from the Board of Elections at that time. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more about where things stand, as well as what our great decision desk is doing behind the scenes and thinking about how this race is going to shake out. And let's go to Dasha Burns, who's in Grand Rapids. And Dasha, I had to interrupt you last time we spoke because we were getting those calls from Missouri. But I think you were running us through a process. I see people standing behind you now. You were talking about ballots coming in there. What is the sense on the ground as far as how things are going, both in the election itself, obviously, but also in terms of this counting, the kind of issues and problems we've seen crop up today, whether they think that is going to be a major problem through the night?
Yeah, Casey, so I've got a little line forming behind me here where these election workers are waiting to deliver these big bags full of ballots and their poll books to the review board the receiving board that's in this room here, who will actually be going through all of those materials. But Grand Rapids is part of Kent County, which is a really fascinating place to watch, both for the primary and for the general. Bernie Sanders had a big upset here back in 2016. He won Kent County by a very wide margin over Hillary Clinton. But in the 2016 general election, Donald Trump carried this county. And so the voters I've been talking to here have been weighing the push and pull of who to choose, who can win back the state of Michigan. And frankly, what you've been talking about all night, electability, the majority of people have been thinking about electability, but the Bernie Sanders voters have been thinking about ideology and values and what lines up with what they actually want to see in terms of of policy, in terms of big change they want to see in this country. One thing that will be interesting to watch, though, is it may be a little while longer than we'd like to wait before we actually find out which of these candidates swept this state, because there's been a rule change here. Voters have a new option that they can actually mail in their ballots, which means there are a lot of absentee ballots to count here, Casey, and that may slow down the process.
Yeah, and of course, one of the critical distinctions there is that people can apparently tear up and throw out their previously mailed-in ballots in Michigan if, say, for example, their chosen candidate drops out of the race, which, of course, causes some changes and potential problems in terms of actually counting those absentee
complicating
ballots. For sure. Dasha Burns, thank you so much. Let's go now out to Washington State, which has so far been the epicenter of this coronavirus outbreak. Also, an interesting test case tonight. They vote entirely by mail. Steve Patterson, I'm looking at a little bit of our data about how much the coronavirus was on the minds of voters out where you are in Washington State. Yeah. The vast majority say that they're either very concerned or somewhat concerned. Just less than 20% of people in Washington State saying that they are not terribly or not at all concerned about the coronavirus. What does it look like to you on the ground as you've been trying to report on this election amid an outbreak?
I think it's different, specifically when you're in these communities that are impacted, that, where you know somebody who knows somebody who may be sick, where you're on a plane in which, I sat next to people on my way here coming back from San Francisco, and there's two parents, and they were talking about their kid's hands were raw because he was so worried about the coronavirus that he kept washing them. So, it's a little bit different when you're here. However, people are not so worried that it's getting in the way of voting, right? A lot of this was mitigated with the voting because, of course, this is mail-in ballots, but a lot of people still have to come and drive and drop it off today. That takes some courage, especially when there's a public safety department telling people who are elderly or have pre-existing conditions or just people in general to try to avoid crowds. It is not an easy thing to do, to come and stand in a line, even though it may be smaller because this is a mail-in state. A lot of this was mitigated, too, for a number of reasons. It's one of the reasons why, despite this being an epicenter, we could see record turnout today. I just spoke to an election official here in King County that's a third of the votes in this state. She is saying that we're already beyond 40% participation. That's pretty huge. Wow. And one of the reasons for that, obviously, is the mail-in ballots. But another reason is that they've moved up the date to March. Remember that in years previous, this thing would happen months ahead. And so it's more relevant. People realize that. Another thing, of course, is that this is no longer a caucus. Before, the Democratic Party would assign delegates based upon it being a caucus. Can you imagine what a caucus would look like in the middle of an epicenter like this? This would be something that may be disastrous to the election process. And so people are now deciding and getting those delegates by primary. And then the third reason is the signaling that they've done. Take a look here. You can see hand sanitizer and wipes pretty much you can't go 5 feet without tripping on one. This, they're calling a sanitizer station. All the workers are wearing gloves when they're handling those ballots. You will see on the ballots some Scotch tape where you might normally not see it because they are telling people not to lick the envelopes. There was a campaign that went out that said, healthy or sick, do not lick. And that's because they don't know how long the virus lives on a surface, but it also signals to people that they're taking care of this. And so I think people have been comfortable with voting and the whole voting process so far, and they feel like it's important in this state. And I think that's a feeling that they haven't had in a little while. And also, despite the fact that there is this virus, I think people feel an overwhelming pressure to do something about their election system this year, and they have. Casey?
Yeah. A pretty remarkable set of what's turned out to be very lucky decisions that were made in Washington, considering the state of things public health-wise. Steve Patterson, thank you very much. Mark Murray, very quickly before we go to break, as I was looking at that map, Idaho, Washington State, both caucuses, no longer caucuses, now primaries, bad news for Bernie Sanders.
That's right. You know, and in a way, the 2016 race played out. Hillary Clinton benefited so much when you had large African-American turnouts and electorates and was able to build up big delegate margins. Bernie Sanders' counteraction to that was doing really well in caucus contests. One of his best victories was in Washington State. This time it's a primary. And in fact, in 2016, when Washington State held a primary 2 months later after the caucuses that counted for delegates, Hillary Clinton actually ended up winning that contest. It didn't count for the delegates, but it does show you the power of the caucuses and how good they were for Bernie Sanders. And when you go to a primary, not as good, potentially.
The most passionate people are making the decisions that seem to have broken Bernie's way. All right, when we come back, we are looking at heading into the top of the hour when polls close in critical Michigan. That is the state we are all watching tonight to see if Bernie Sanders can pull off an upset the way he did in 2016, or if he can't, are there major signals that Joe Biden is potentially on a cruise path to victory in this nomination? We will be right back. Don't go.
White terrorism and white supremacist terrorism in this country is not some weird analog to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. It's not some foreign thing that looks like something that we've been fighting in the war on terror. It's actually fundamentally as American as anything. And it is an existential threat to the multiracial and pluralistic, equal, and open democracy that we've been fighting for in this country since people died on the battlefield in the Civil War.
Hey everybody, Steve Kornacki back here at the big board.
It's more than numbers.
These are the states that are going to winnow the field. They're probably going to create a front runner.
It's what those numbers mean.
Ideologically, you're seeing in this first wave a very similar electorate to what you saw in 2016. But age-wise, this is the big variable.
This is why we don't allow Steve Kornacki to leave the building this time of year.
Nobody breaks it down like Kornacki.
Need your true crime fix on the go? Dateline episodes are available as podcasts. Mysteries with a twist from the True Crime Original. Wow. Listen to Dateline wherever you get your podcasts.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news. This is all I've got left.
Who brought more to the caucuses?
It's news made for your streaming world. Live weekdays, 3 to 11 p.m. Eastern.
Something new from Meet the Press, the Chuck Toddcast.
An insider's take on politics and more with some of my favorite reporters.
Get it for free wherever you get your podcasts.
We've got this fundamental thing about human beings, and we've got the way that we constitute our politics. And the danger is that if our politics grow too tribal, they grow excessively tribal, then we'll lose this sort of way of talking.
Why is this happening? With Chris Hayes. Subscribe now.
From Las Vegas, Manchester, from Washington. Why should your judgment be valued?
I'd stake my judgment against anyone out there.
Is party unity your concern right now, or is simply winning as many states as you can?
Well, it's both. NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
We get to have our very own Today Family Getaway.
It's so exciting to be here.
We are serving up a Today Cafe special.
Universal Orlando Resort is the place. We have just loved seeing your beautiful shining faces.
How sweet is that?
Welcome back. back. You're watching NBC News Now's live coverage of our primary night in America. We are watching Michigan most closely. Their polls are set to all close at 9 p.m. So we're going to bring you the very latest and greatest from our NBC News decision desk at the top of the hour when we have a sense of what we're ready to say about that race. But I want to bring in now Maria Teresa Kumar, who has been watching along with us. She is in San Francisco, I believe. Maria,
yes.
Teresa, what are you watching in Michigan as we head toward the poll close here? This is a state where, and we can't emphasize this enough, Bernie Sanders pulled out that upset win in 2016 and where he had staked most of his campaign, at least this week, trying to prove that he again can pull out some surprises.
Exactly. So a couple of things. In 2018, Michigan modernized their elections. So this is the very first time that Michigan is allowing people to go ahead and register to vote on the same day. And already the Secretary of State is saying that they're seeing a 95% jump in mail-in ballots. You're seeing 7,000 people go in and register today and cast a ballot. So it talks, one, about the modernization. It'll be interesting to see who's participating. What is that different mix? Is it more young people? Is it more people of color? We're already starting to see a feed of individuals in Dearborn, which is mostly Muslim Americans, coming in and packing the place and waiting for hours to make sure that they are casting a ballot. So there's definitely some enthusiasm. What I will be looking for is, who are they going for? Are the same counties that Bernie won, are they going to stay Bernie, or are some of those folks going to siphon off and go for Biden? Individuals that Hillary wasn't able to bring over. And if it does happen, all of a sudden, Casey, that is the case, that some individuals basically defect from the Bernie camp to the Biden camp, it starts talking about this idea that that Biden is a unifier, that he's bringing people together, and that people are looking for some sort of sense of stability. Something that you mentioned before was that people felt confident that in a crisis, Biden could step up. And that has a lot to do with the fact that he was the vice president. He understands how government works in complex systems. He did head up the Ebola, was one of the people that was overseeing the Ebola pandemic. And in a time when people are saying, I need to trust my government to get this right, it would be interesting to see how people are actually how the coronavirus specifically is impacting their vote today.
No, that makes a lot of sense, Maria Teresa. And Carrie Dan, very quickly as we head toward the top of the hour here, that critical area in Michigan, and actually it looks as though we only have a handful of seconds left till we're going to be able to make some sort of projection here. It is 9 o'clock, and at this hour, NBC News can say that it is too early to call the state of Michigan, but Joe Biden leads at this hour at 9 p.m. as polls are closing. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the direction where this might be headed, although we have to be, of course, very careful. Our decision desk not quite ready to say one way or the other whether Biden is going to win, but he does lead at this hour. There's also a good sign here, and I'm looking at this graphic. It looks like we are seeing some raw vote totals underneath those names for Biden and Sanders. That is good news for what we had been watching kind of going into this, because there had been some question about how quickly the state of Michigan was going to count the vote. And we're actually waiting to hear from Michigan Secretary of State at a news conference that is about to start any minute. But the fact that we are seeing any numbers at all is a good sign, Mark Murray, and it is significant that at this point we're already able to say that Biden is ahead.
Yeah. So, Casey, my understanding is when it was going to come from the slow voting, a lot of it had to do with the absentees. And so what we're kind of seeing right now are probably the non-absentee getting rid of it. But yes. So let's recap just the past hour so far. You end up having Joe Biden projected the winner in Mississippi, in Missouri, leading in Michigan right now. And Casey, what I'm really interested in is the delegate math. And of course, that's actually how you become.
Hold on, Mark. I'm gonna pause you there for a second, because we do have some breaking news. NBC News can now project that Joe Biden is going to win the state of Michigan. As you can see, this is a huge, it is 9:01:48 by our clock here in our Washington, D.C. studio. This is not necessarily a race that we were confident we would be able to call at the close because We were watching it. If it's a really tight race, as all of you know, watching election coverage, it can go late into the night. That is not what is happening here tonight. This is a major blow for Bernie Sanders, who, of course, won the state of Michigan over Hillary Clinton back in 2016 and had pinned his hopes for the nomination, or at least at this stage in the fight, I should say, on the state of Michigan. And he is now going to lose it to Joe Biden. So, Mark, let's go right back to your delegate math.
Yes, and saying it was a good night for Joe Biden. And the fact that almost right after poll closing, Michigan goes for Joe Biden, a great night. But here's the delegate math situation, and that's what actually leads to get somebody to become the nominee. And on the best case scenario that Carrie, Dan, and I were mapping out for Bernie Sanders going into tonight, say a narrow victory in Michigan, you hold tight in Missouri, Washington State, you do pretty well. We actually had Joe Biden still getting an 8 or 10 delegate net haul out of tonight. Best night for Joe Biden was him getting some 60 or 70 net delegates, and that included a win, actually a close win in Michigan, pretty good win in Missouri, decisive win in Mississippi. If this is going to be a humongous victory in Michigan, maybe you actually have to bump up that net delegate haul from 60, 70, maybe 80. But this was supposed to be Bernie Sanders' good 2 weeks in March. And the next 2 weeks are going to get tougher, and the delegate math gets tougher for him.
Yeah, I mean, let's just try to try and explain it as simply as possible for viewers. Right now, we're on track for Biden to add to his delegate lead over Bernie Sanders. And I think people at home are wondering, Carrie, Dan, at what point does Biden kind of run away with this if this is the trend? I don't think we're able to say that tonight, but I'm hoping you have a little bit more to back me up on that. But if it's not tonight, next week we've got a lot of contests across the Midwest. Is that potentially a place where Biden can take this to a place where Bernie Sanders can't catch up or not?
Well, I think we've got two things. You've got the narrative and then you've got the actual delegate count. One thing about the narrative that's so important about Michigan is that Donald Trump just barely won the state of Michigan. If Bernie Sanders wanted to make the case that I'm the person who can beat Donald Trump and Joe Biden can't, the fact that we made a poll call close 90 seconds or a call 90 seconds after polls closed, that's a very bad sign for Bernie Sanders' argument that he's more electable. But from a delegate count perspective, next week does not look great for Bernie Sanders either. Florida and Georgia, both big states, both have high African-American populations, both have retiree populations, obviously Florida, and Florida has more conservative Latinos than elsewhere in the country. All three of those are really bad for Bernie Sanders and could portend a huge delegate haul for Joe Biden, which if we're not at that point right now that he's running away with it, I think it's very difficult to see a scenario without a radical change in the narrative, which Michigan certainly doesn't give to Senator Sanders, anything that is going to change that trajectory.
Yeah, I mean, Beth Fooey, let's be straight about this. I mean, this loss in Michigan is a body blow to Bernie Sanders' campaign. And, I struggle to see how he comes back from this for all the reasons that Carrie Dan just laid out.
That he was never able to change the narrative. And, Casey, I have a theory about this, and it all comes back to coronavirus. I feel like after last weekend, Super Tuesday, which is admittedly a very bad night for Bernie Sanders, but he did have a week potentially to turn it around. He could have figured out a way to sort of grab back momentum in Michigan, elsewhere, sort of mitigate some of those delegate losses that we're likely to see in these states. The coronavirus story sort of froze everything in place. It froze the whole campaign in place. It was very hard for any of these candidates to get any sort of message out that wasn't related to this illness. We also started seeing polling roll out, and we've seen it tonight in the exit polls, as you mentioned, that overwhelmingly voters see Biden rather than Bernie Sanders as the president or the person that they would like to see manage a crisis. So it was just a 1-2 punch. The fact that the news cycle sort of froze the way it didn't allow Bernie Sanders to sort of like reclaim any oxygen going forward into these contests. Plus, it basically exposed something that voters appear to be worried about with him, that he can't necessarily be the leader to take on a crisis. And we are in the middle of a crisis. And so leadership through something like this matters much more to voters right now than it might have at another time.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And Karine Jean-Pierre, just to underscore what Beth was saying, I mean, Bernie Sanders did have this week to try and figure out how to break through. And frankly, they threw a lot at it. I mean, Bernie Sanders was attacking Joe Biden in his, public statements, appearances, also on the air, to the point that the Biden campaign, pushed back with an ad back against Bernie Sanders. I mean, they were taking steps to try and at least do things that would catch. I mean, he did interviews, you know. I mean, he hasn't sat for, you know, these kinds of interviews. He sat down with our Rachel Maddow for an hour. But at the end of the day, I mean, it was subsumed by what we've all been talking about over the course of the last week, which is this escalating challenge with coronavirus.
Yeah. So what we're seeing right now is momentum is just it's a powerful political force right now in this primary. And when South Carolina happened with Jim Clyburn endorsing Biden and that momentum of Biden winning that primary and then going into Super Tuesday, the momentum was behind Biden, and Bernie has not been able to catch up, has not been able to blunt Biden's momentum. And like that, what was just said is that you really need to have a message, right? Because it's about the narrative and it's about the momentum and it's about the message. And Bernie's message was going after the establishment. When we're talking about a time where people are saying we want to get rid of Donald Trump, we want to unify, and also when he was talking about the establishment, it sounded like he was attacking African-American voters, black voters, for going for Biden, because that's basically how Biden got catapulted into that momentum. So Bernie was not able to really blunt what Biden was able to do, and his messaging was off. And now he's in a place where the math is running away from him. And, you know, Michigan was supposed to be a state that he needed to win to stop that momentum that Biden had.
Yeah, no, and clearly that is not shaping up. I mean, he abandoned a speech he was supposed to give in Mississippi, essentially ceding the South to go campaign.
He didn't go to Selma,
in Michigan.
Alabama.
Yeah, that really stood out to me around the anniversary events for Bloody Sunday. No, it's all very well taken. I think that we can go now to one of our favorites, Mike Memley, who I think has made it to Philadelphia. Yes, he has. Yet another madcap scramble for Mike Memley, racing from one state to the next to try and catch up with the latest turn in the Biden campaign, this time, of course, because of coronavirus. But, I mean, Mike, when I saw you in New Hampshire and they were, you know, bailing out the last time you had to do this, they were, you know, he announced, he goes to a Dunkin' Donuts. He has announced his campaign is pulling out before polls have even closed to run to South Carolina to try to get their campaign back on track. I think a lot of us who saw him on the trail that day felt as though, you know, as a candidate, he clearly was struggling. He gave, you know, a press conference that seemed kind of, you know, long-winded to a lot of us. I realize you cover him every day, so it probably was not as surprising to you. But, I mean, the change in fortune for this campaign obviously reached a crescendo on Super Tuesday, but has just not let up tonight.
No, that's absolutely right, Casey. And some of this is about the fact that the Biden campaign has always been rather confident in their strategy, even in the face of an awful lot of doubters and a lot of evidence, frankly, to suggest that the path was not going to play out as they hoped. A lot of that strategy, of course, has to do with African-American voters and his strength among that demographic, which, again, is showing to be just one of the stories of tonight. And the other thing, I think, is the Bernie Sanders effect, and clearly the fact that Bernie Sanders came out of those first three contests looking so strong, especially after Nevada, coming over 50% of the vote, scared the moderate wing, the establishment of the party, whatever you want to call them, enough that they were looking for a quick fix, a quick alternative. And it was Biden's strength in South Carolina, helped by a good debate performance. Of course, the Jim Clyburn endorsement so significant there as well, that he very quickly became the candidate of choice. Now, in looking at the map tonight and the results so far, there's a lot of repeat from what we saw last week in terms of how the week has played out from the perspective of the Biden team. Mississippi, they always knew and felt confident in a good result there. Bernie Sanders 4 years ago had his worst defeat there to Hillary Clinton of any state. Hillary Clinton had over 80% of the vote there. Biden on track, not necessarily to top that, but to do in the same ballpark. Running up the score there in Mississippi, even if it's not a big delegate haul, was going to give the Biden team enough cushion that even if the biggest prize of tonight, Michigan, didn't go their way, they would probably still end up with more delegates on the night. But then in the case of Michigan, it's interesting, Casey, the Biden team has not had enough money to do their own polling. And so they really didn't know what to trust in terms of even the public numbers that we saw in the last few days. they knew, of course, what happened in 2016 to Hillary Clinton there, that she was tripped up there late by perhaps being caught napping, and Bernie Sanders able to upset her in Michigan, extend the nomination fight beyond that. What they did in Michigan was similar to what we saw play out in Texas last week, which was put in a full effort there, send their surrogates there, and ultimately the candidate himself, and do on Monday night what they did last week, which is bring two of their former rivals, in this case Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, for a little bit of shock and awe treatment, doing a big splashy event on the eve of the primary to send them into the election day with a lot of momentum. And that's what turned out to be the same result here as it was last week in Texas, Casey.
Yeah. Mike, to turn more sobering for a second, walk me through their thinking on the coronavirus question. I mean, obviously, they canceled their rally in Ohio, moved the event to Philadelphia. He's now, I understand, planning a speech tomorrow in Wilmington, Delaware. What else is going on behind the scenes? How is the campaign grappling with this crisis in a logistical way, but also in terms of, perhaps looking ahead to a general election in a situation where they're not campaigning, but they're also running against a president who's potentially struggling?
Well, in terms of just the day-to-day life on the campaign trail, we saw last night as we arrived for that big rally in Detroit something we haven't seen, which is volunteers at all of the entrances squirting hand sanitizer into everybody who walked into the doorway. We also know, and you've seen it on the campaign trail yourself, Casey, how much Joe Biden really does relish the retail aspect of campaign life. And he seems uncertain at times whether he can still do that, whether he can shake hands, whether he's doing the elbow bumps, the fist bumps. He's doing a little bit of everything at this moment. So certainly just in that very superficial way, it's changing the campaign in that regard. In terms of what it means going forward, the Biden campaign had already announced a schedule into next Monday for the events leading into the next round of primaries, of course, starting with where I thought I would be with you tonight, from Cleveland, Ohio. And obviously, they've changed that. He's going to give this speech on Thursday now in Wilmington. And really, it's a presidential moment for the Biden campaign in a race in which they've always felt that was their big advantage over Donald Trump, looking presidential in a party that desperately wants to elect a president to defeat Donald Trump. And so that's sort of their mindset going forward, to seize the moment, to reassure the public, and to begin that contrast with President Trump at a very early stage.
Yeah. All right, Mike Memoli, thank you very much, my friend. We will, of course, be watching for Mr. Biden to appear there in Philadelphia. But I think we are going now to Chris Jansing, who we find in Detroit, Michigan, where we are waiting to hear, I think, from state officials. Chris, this clearly has broken away in a more sort of sudden, quick direction for Joe Biden than perhaps we expected. There had been a lot of questions about how quickly they were going to be able to get things counted and whether this would be a tight race that we were counting into the night. That is not how it's playing out.
Actually, yeah, this would obviously be a press conference that was a lot more import. If we had a 1 or 2 point race, right? Still, there are questions being asked about why they're not going to get a final vote count until probably sometime early tomorrow afternoon. That's what we're waiting to hear from the Secretary of State. But look, the bottom line seems to be something called no reason absentee voting. It used to be you had to have certain requirements to be an absentee voter here. Now that goes away. You simply have to request a ballot, and 993,814 Michiganders did as of this morning, and the number could increase because they could be returned by 8 o'clock tonight. 804,216 had returned, a return rate of an impressive 81%. But then those votes need to be counted, and the simple fact of the matter is that some voting places were able to ramp up, hire extra people. They could start tabulating those ballots as early as this morning. When the polls opened, they could start counting those votes. Others simply didn't because they couldn't afford to. Is it because that they couldn't find people who would do it? Whatever the reason, some of them may not even have started to count those return ballots. I can tell you that earlier I was in Wayne County at a suburban polling place outside of Detroit. The number of absentee ballots there was up 184%. And they don't have just one person person counting them. They count in teams. They want to make sure about the integrity of the ballot. So they have to go through that, check it and double check it before they put it into a tabulator. So that's what's causing these delays. Look, the whole point of this law, Casey, this no reason absentee ballot was to expand voting, right? The whole idea was you shouldn't have to jump through a lot of hoops to get an absentee ballot. You should just get the absentee ballot and be able to put it in. But they're seeing now that the number of people who requested it, the number of people who have returned it, they haven't been able to count them as quickly as maybe they would have liked. We're waiting for some answers from the Secretary of State. Casey?
Chris Jansing, thank you very much for that update. Certainly, at the very least, this does not seem to be anywhere close to what remains the major debacle of this election cycle, which was the caucus in Iowa. Panel, let's talk through some of these numbers we're getting in here among union voters. Actually, I'm going to push pause on that because we're going to go to Josh Letterman before we get to our conversation about union voters. Josh, you are in Cleveland, Ohio, although, frankly, we could talk about this considering Ohio's next up on the map. That's why you're there. This is going to be the next slate of primaries, potentially a decisive one, decisive night, considering how well Joe Biden has done. You know, I think major questions about whether Bernie Sanders will be able to continue if he isn't able to get a foothold in some of these Midwestern states coming up next week. But union voters breaking overwhelmingly for Biden tonight. In Missouri, 60-35. In Michigan, 54-42 over Bernie Sanders. What does that tell you about where things may head in Ohio as we look ahead?
Yeah, that's a great point, Casey. Ohio sharing a lot of these demographic similarities with a state like Michigan, which is why the Michigan contest has been so closely looked at as a harbinger of how these candidates are going to do as this race moves more into the Midwest, into states like Ohio, as well as Illinois. We're starting to see the Sanders campaign try to lower expectations. Obviously, they saw some from their own polling in the last couple of days that this was not likely to be in Michigan a repeat of the kind of upset victory that Sanders was able to pull off 4 years ago. Just in the last hour or so, as Bernie Sanders was landing in Vermont, where he is going to spend the night, he put out a fundraising email saying, look, we expect the results tonight to get better for Bernie Sanders the later into the night that it gets, and as the races start to move more out to the west. That's obviously a reference to Washington State, where the Sanders campaign feels like they probably have their best prospect tonight, given all of these other states that are not trending their way. But there's another reason, Casey, why this Michigan loss, as projected by NBC News for Sanders, is so devastating. And that's that from the beginning, every time Bernie Sanders has been asked the question, what is the math that gets a socialist elected president in America, he's gone over and over again back to this argument about how he is going to be able to bring in these new first-time voters, young voters, fresh into the process. If Bernie Sanders is not able to do that in a state like Michigan, a battleground state where Democrats are going to need that high turnout come November, it's really going to dent his ability to argue that he is an electable candidate against Donald Trump, especially as we see these exit polls showing over and over again that Democratic primary voters right now seem to be looking at Joe Biden as the unity candidate that they do think has that prospect of defeating the president.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. Josh Letterman in Cleveland for us. Thank you. And Shauna Thomas, I keep going back to, so, you know, I covered Bernie Sanders on the plane in 2016. And, you know, I remember being with him in Michigan. I remember, in fact, Mark Murray was on a conference call telling everyone how surprised they were. And fair enough, the polling reflected that. But being on the ground, you know, I mean, I remember walking into these arenas and thinking there is something really going on here. And I think, you know, I was not terribly surprised. But that came at a point, you know, midway through the primary cycle. And it gave his campaign new life. And he ultimately went on to stay in, even though the further contests kind of eroded that. And eventually it was clear Hillary Clinton was going to win this nomination. I think my question sitting here right now is, what does Bernie Sanders decide to do? And at what point is he forced to make some tough decisions? It may be too early sitting here now, but by next Tuesday, it may be very clear he needs to make a different decision. I'm not convinced that he's going to be getting out of this race before the convention. which it makes it, when you're framing an argument about beating Donald Trump, it seems like a tough position to me.
That is a really tough position. I think the one thing that I'm curious about, one, how much money does he have? And I don't know that off the top of my head. And I think that determines something about how long he can stay in, and two, where the splits go. So right now what we're saying is, sorry, I'm looking at one of the screens, they're both viable in Michigan, right? So he will get some of the votes there.
Right, and that's likely to be true throughout simply because of the nature of a one-on-one, man-on-man race.
Exactly, but also that the delegate math he's still going to pick up the delegates. The problem is the media message will be Joe Biden won Michigan when Bernie Sanders lost it last time. Joe Biden runs away with Mississippi because of the African-American vote. So what is the winning story he can tell coming out of this that lasts him until we get to the Florida vote, which you've already said doesn't look great for Bernie Sanders? And if he can't figure out what that message is beyond I can beat Donald Trump and also I want to overhaul the entire healthcare system, then I think you start to really think about what are you going to say in this next week?
Right.
And I can't figure out what that message is if all of those other messages are coming from the Joe Biden campaign and he is able to pick up his fundraising because the momentum is with him.
There's a really big difference between now and 2016. In 2016, it was an open race. The Republicans were running their competitive primary. Democrats were on theirs as well. This time around, there's an incumbent president, Donald Trump, in office. And there are a lot of Democrats who want to turn to the general election as soon as possible. I do think there's going to be less patience for somebody saying, hey, I'm going to go on the convention with all of my delegates, even though I do think that that's probably the most likely situation for Bernie Sanders. And look, we've been on the air for now just a little bit over an hour. On my Twitter feed, there are already major Democratic groups like Priorities USA, Action Guy Cecil had a tweet saying the primary season, it's over. The math is done. It's important for everyone to come to the table and start getting behind Joe Biden. He's going to be our nominee. Some people might say, whoa, that is way too early.
Actually done, though?
People might say that is way too early. On the other hand, I do think we are going to end up seeing this kind of sentiment play out in the days and weeks ahead from Democrats.
And Bernie Sanders a bit kind of boxed himself into a new position in this cycle.
Yeah, he absolutely did.
Because at the NBC debate, Chuck Todd, our big boss, asked the question of everybody on stage, should the candidate with the most pledged delegates going into the convention get the nomination? And Bernie Sanders was the one who said yes. Everybody else said let the process play out. Bernie Sanders said yes. At the time, it sure as heck looked like he was going to be that person.
Right. Now he was going to go to the convention floor with a plurality, and everyone else was going to be behind it.
By the way, that was a change in his position from where he was in 2016. In 2016, he wanted to fight it out. He wanted to vie for superdelegates. He wanted to do some horse trading and somehow get that plurality going into the convention. And so he has boxed himself up in a way that now he's either going to have to reverse a position that he's already reversed or say, you know what, I'm behind and Joe Biden is the one with the most, with the plurality going into Milwaukee.
Yeah, I mean, I think, covering Bernie Sanders, the man, there were a lot of people who were trying to convince him to drop out of that race, and nobody could. And so I think really he and possibly his wife, Jane, are the only two people that are ever going to answer this question, despite any outside pressure that, as Mark Murray was saying, is already building. All right, we are going to take a little bit of a break, but when we come back, much more analysis as we wait for more states still to come on this map tonight, and more a deeper look at the state of Michigan and how Joe Biden managed to win there, a major win for Joe Biden tonight. We'll be right back.
We are serving up a Today Cafe special.
Universal Orlando Resort is the place. We have just loved seeing your beautiful shining faces.
How sweet is that?
Need your true crime fix on the go? Dateline episodes are available as podcasts. Mysteries with a twist from the True Crime Original. Wow. Listen to Dateline wherever you get your podcasts.
You're watching NBC News Now. We've got some breaking news. This is all I've got left.
Who brought more to the caucuses?
It's news made for your streaming world. Live weekdays, 3 to 11 p.m. Eastern.
We've got this fundamental thing about human beings, and then we've got the way that we constitute our politics. And the danger is that if our politics grow too tribal, then we'll lose this sort of way of talking.
Why is this happening? With Chris Hayes. Subscribe now.
Welcome back. This is a live look at the podium where in just moments from now, we expect to see Joe Biden, the former vice president of the United States, now, of course, running for president and having a banner night as NBC News projects that he will win primary contests in Mississippi, Missouri, and Michigan. Still watching for Idaho, Washington State, and North Dakota, other states voting tonight, but that we have not projected quite yet. We will bring that to you as soon as we get it. But we're going to go live now to Shaquille Brewster, who is on the road with Bernie Sanders in Burlington, Vermont. An unexpected stop for them tonight. Shaq, Bernie Sanders also was supposed to be in Cleveland holding a rally that got canceled because of concerns about coronavirus. And I think the reality here, as these results have rolled in, Shaq, and we were just talking about this around the table, is what kind of pressure is there on Bernie Sanders to make a decision about his, staying in this race? I mean, I covered him long enough to know that he'll be very angry to learn that anyone is having this conversation at all at this stage. But there are already top Democrats in the party saying, hey, it is time for us to come together behind Joe Biden. What are you hearing?
Vice President Biden. It was earlier today when he was in Detroit where he was asked, is Michigan a must-win state for you? And what does it say if you don't win the state of Michigan? And you heard him give that standard response that he has, which is you can't read into any one state that it's about the process, that it's more than just any one state. But Casey, without a doubt, this is a big loss for Senator Sanders. As you mentioned first, he was supposed to be in Cleveland, Ohio tonight. That was where his election night celebration was going to be, or election night rally. Instead, he rerouted to Burlington, Vermont. We still don't know if we'll hear from him tonight. His campaign is not giving us an answer either way, but we do know he will be in Burlington. He was scheduled to be in Burlington after going to Cleveland anyways, but he will be here in Burlington, and we'll wait to see if we hear any comment from Senator Sanders. I think it's also important to kind of set expectations and let you know what the campaign was saying as we were coming into tonight. I spoke with a senior aide just last night and just kind of laid out the map. What states are you looking at? And I was told the states that they felt hopeful about. Key, they didn't say optimistic. The states they felt hopeful about were Washington, Idaho, and of course the state of Michigan. Michigan being the big prize. There was symbolic significance, as this aide told me. It goes into that key electability argument that you hear from Sanders, that he can bring out the energy and excitement needed to beat Donald Trump in those key Midwestern states. Tonight, losing in Michigan, losing it and having it be called about 90 seconds after polls closed in that state, it was definitely, Casey, a major blow for this campaign.
And Shaq, I mean, what is the path forward if we push ahead to next week? I mean, obviously, we're still carefully counting the delegates here. The math is not uncomplicated. Right. It could potentially take a long time for either of these candidates to rack up a majority of pledged delegates or even a substantial, clear plurality. Is Senator Sanders prepared to go all the way to the convention with this, do you think, based on your reporting and conversations with the campaign?
It depends on how you look at it, Casey. I mean, we know, and you know this from covering him in 2016, he definitely has the financial resources. That is not a problem for this campaign. You saw that fundraising email that went out from his campaign manager, kind of warning and cautioning his supporters and saying, hey, the results are not going to look good early on, but wait until we get out west. Those results will look better. Don't listen to the media. Don't listen to what the pundits are saying. You saw that messaging. So it's not going to be a question of whether or not he has the resources. He doesn't have to call up donors or calm down donors after a couple of bad nights, 2 bad nights in a row, Super Tuesday and then coming into tonight. The question now turns to that box that he nearly put himself in when he was in a much different position. And I heard you guys talking about this earlier, but it started with that debate stage at our debate in Las Vegas where he said, if the candidate with the plurality of pledged delegates, even if a candidate doesn't get the majority, the candidate leading or who has the most delegates should be the party's nominee because it would be mayhem. It would be like robbing the voter's say or undoing the will of the voter. That was the point that he made. And if we are starting to get to a point where Vice President Biden, and as you mentioned, it's early, we still need to see the delegates come in. The campaign is always quick to point out that even in California, a state that we didn't call yet, there are still more delegates to come in for Senator Sanders from what they believe. But it goes into the idea of if Vice President Biden is getting a lead that is insurmountable, it could be trouble for them. Casey?
For sure, and that plurality box is an interesting one for Bernie Sanders to be in, and I think it is important to point out, Shaq, that these two men are going to face off on the debate stage in Arizona coming up this week. I think I personally would be surprised if Bernie Sanders decided to do anything dramatic before having a chance to do that one-on-one. Of course, there's going to be no audience there because of coronavirus. Shaq Brewster, thank you as always, my friend. It is great to see you. Stay safe on the trail and keep us posted if we think we're going to hear at all from Bernie Sanders tonight. But let's go now to our Vaughn Hilliard. He is in Missouri, Florissant, Missouri. We were able to call Missouri for Joe Biden earlier tonight. Vaughn, we've been seeing the vote tallies ticking upward there. What else are you keeping an eye on as this night unfolds? Really, just another banner one for Joe Biden here.
You and Chuck were just talking about looking at that map beyond. Here in Missouri, when I was talking to voters, there was a sense of frustration about where Missouri now sees itself on the electoral map. At one point, they like to consider themselves a purple state, a place that could elect a Democrat. But what they've seen in recent years here, Casey, is Republicans only expand their support here in the state. And that's where there, two voters earlier that I talked to, they said it's time. Joe Biden needed to be their pick because they believed that he was the individual that could make best the case to go and win over more of those white, moderate voters here in the state. And you guys were talking about the map there. I'll go back to Congresswoman Tlaib from the Detroit area when we're talking about Michigan. And there was a lot of conversation over what would a Bernie Sanders nomination look like? What was his path to victory? A lot of that had to do with support that he was finding from the likes of Congresswoman Tlaib, who represents the greater Detroit area, Wayne County. Those are one of those counties, Casey, that saw a significant drop-off in voter turnout in 2016 that you could well make the case if that county had turned out at the same levels. It's the most diverse county in the state. Had turned out at the same levels as it had in 2012 for Barack Obama, that Hillary Clinton may have well won the state of Michigan. But also, 1 week ago, it was in Minnesota. Joe Biden won Minnesota, and it was Congresswoman Omar, another backer of Bernie Sanders, who thought that they could help put Bernie Sanders over the top in Minnesota, another state that is up for grabs come November. And I think that's when you're looking at the map for Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. If Bernie Sanders wants to make the case that he's the best position to beat Donald Trump, one would think that you need to be able to win in places like Minnesota, in Michigan. And I think that's why if you look 1 week from now, Casey, to Arizona, it's pivotal. Joe Biden, at least according to polling, seems to have a pretty sturdy lead in Florida, which will also be voting next Tuesday. But when you look at the course of this next week, that debate, of course, will be taking place in Phoenix. And then Tuesday, Arizona voters will be going to the polls to decide between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. And Arizona, this 2020 race in November, Casey, could come down to Arizona and whether it goes blue. Hillary Clinton beat Bernie Sanders there 4 years ago, but there is one subsection of voters that have really stuck behind Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden has suggested that he's building the Obama coalition, but there are Hispanic voters, Latino voters that have continued to stick by Bernie Sanders. You looked in Nevada, Bernie Sanders won about 50%. According to Nevada entrance polling. You look at California, Bernie Sanders won about 55% of Latino voters in California. And so when you're looking at the map ahead for Bernie Sanders, if he wants to hold on, he's got to continue to have a strong hold of support among Latino voters. And if you're Joe Biden, you see Tuesday in Arizona is that opportunity to really build up that Obama coalition by drawing in a greater share of Latino voters and being able to make the case that not only does he have an expansive, diverse electorate of support, but also that he'd be able to win the likes of Arizona against Donald Trump next November.
Fair point. Von Hilliard, thank you very much, my friend. While you and I were talking, it sounds like Andrew Yang, former presidential candidate, just endorsed Joe Biden. So, again, this race has been moving very fast. If you are just joining us, you are watching a big night in America. We are covering primaries across the map. We have projected that Joe Biden is the winner in Missouri's primary. He is also the projected winner in Mississippi and the projected winner in the critical state of Michigan. This is what we were watching most closely, the biggest delegate prize on the map, but also one incredibly important to the overall arc of this primary. This is a big night for Joe Biden, the former vice president whose campaign was brought back to life in South Carolina, possibly by Jim Clyburn, depending on who you believe, went on to a major rally on Super Tuesday after winning endorsements from Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, who appeared with him on stage in Texas. Turned into a huge night for him. He has since gone on to roll up a lot of those states on Super Tuesday. Mike Bloomberg also dropping out of this race. Elizabeth Warren bowing out as well. She's really the only major candidate that hasn't gotten in line yet behind Joe Biden. So, Mark Murray, you were talking already about what you've seen on Twitter, among other Democrats, the conversation really moving to say, OK, hey, guys, we got Donald Trump to take on in the fall. We better start doing it right now.
This is a party that's beginning to coalesce, and maybe it actually takes over a 2 or 3 month period to finally get there for everybody. And of course, you know, I would fully expect Bernie Sanders to continue to campaign. When people ended up saying, even, you know, well, do you have the plurality of delegates? Knowing the Bernie Sanders from 2016, he'll end up saying, well, New York's going to be voting in April. Let's see what New Yorkers have to say. And he'll go on to contest. Yep. But Casey, I just want to. It's been a remarkable month. And I remember being on the set in Manchester, New Hampshire, when we were with Chuck and Carrie and Joe Biden, as you mentioned to Mike Mimley, he left. He went out. And Chuck Todd had this great point on what happened to middle-class Joe Biden, you know, as far as like, you know, the person who, if you can win Scranton, Pennsylvania, you should be able to win places like Manchester and New Hampshire. And all of a sudden, with the endorsement from Jim Clyburn, I actually think the second place finish that he had in Nevada, then the campaign getting, the candidate field getting much smaller. Yeah. But we're in the situation where a month later, it looked like Joe Biden was dead. He is now just steamrolling through this primary, and I don't know when necessarily Bernie Sanders can stop him.
Yeah, Carrie, Dan, you're looking, you know, I realize like every Tuesday for however many weeks, your life is very organized around what
you
primary.
You can see all the Google spreadsheets I have.
Voters are voting. Is there a place where Bernie Sanders has a chance to change this narrative or not?
You know, I think Von Hilliard had a good point about Latino voters, that is a group that Bernie Sanders did make a shift with. Yes. He knew in 2016 he had a problem with black voters. He also had a problem with Latino voters. With black voters, he has not been able to address that. We've seen that in primary after primary. But Latino voters, we did see him able to do it. It's interesting. We've been talking a lot about union workers tonight. We had that conversation in Nevada as well about the culinary workers union, which was a hugely powerful union in Nevada that sort of fought against Bernie Sanders, at least from their leadership's perspective. But the rank and file did support him, but that's also a majority Latino group. Right. And he's been able, and in Texas as well, to do well with those voters. They are young. They are ascendant in the Democratic coalition. I think if he's able to prove in maybe Arizona, Florida's the Hispanic population in Florida is very different than in Arizona. If he's able to say, look, Joe Biden has a weak spot here with Latino voters and Biden isn't able to bring them into the fold despite all the other momentum he has, Sanders will be able to make a point there for sure that I think will be important and might highlight a problem that Democrats have going into a general election if Joe Biden is the nominee. But as far as the way the math is stacking up, and Democratic voters also in 2016 didn't have a large field of ex-candidates who coalesced behind Hillary Clinton. This time around, there's a whole lot of people who have high name recognition among Democratic primary voters.
Buy-in and support.
Maybe they really liked Pete Buttigieg, or they liked Amy Klobuchar, or they liked Andrew Yang, and now they've all been signaled to everybody get on the boat and row together.
I do want to give Bernie Sanders a little benefit of the doubt. I know 2016 and how that race played out and watched it, intimately. But the difference in going back to this is Donald Trump is actually the president of the United States. And I think that is a factor that Bernie Sanders will weigh in. And if you believe everything Bernie Sanders has said about President Trump and everything the Democratic Party is saying and what the constituents are saying about beating him, I think he will seriously have to consider, if tonight doesn't go well and next week doesn't go well, what does him staying in do to the overall race? And I know he's very clear on what he wants to do for this country and how he wants to remake things. But he's a senator. He's a United States senator, and yes, he's an independent senator. I get it. I know.
We'll see. I mean, we'll see.
President Trump has changed a lot about politics, and it might change Bernie Sanders a little bit, too.
Maybe.
To Shauna's point, earlier today, the campaign manager for the Bernie Sanders campaign, Faz Shakir, ended up retweeting the RNC's digital director on a video of Joe Biden confronting that union worker today in Michigan. And it almost seemed as if you ended up having the Trump campaign and the RNC teaming up with the Bernie Sanders campaign. And one of the dangers that you're going to hear from a lot of Democrats is say, hey, Bernie, don't give the Trump and the RNC any kind of ammunition. And that's actually going to be one of the cross pressures you also see, too.
Biden explicitly has ads that make that accusation, that say, Bernie Sanders, these attacks are not helping. It's time for us to come together.
Yeah, no, that was the main kind of message we saw from the Biden camp this week. Some of it lost behind coronavirus news. But if you did see that ad, it said exactly what Carrie was pointing out. Beth Lee, let me pick up on a point Carrie was making earlier, too, this question of Latino voters, but specifically this question of Florida. And, she referenced the fact that obviously the Hispanic voting population in Florida is a unique and special one and has different cross pressures than some of the other Hispanic populations in states across the country. But what I'm wondering, as we watch this and we look at what Bernie Sanders is going to decide to do, how his campaign is going to move forward, he made some comments in that 60 Minutes interview about Fidel Castro. He said, yes, he was terrible, but he had literacy programs. And those comments were not received very well by many in the Cuban-American population, by many Democrats, frankly. I wonder now if, looking back, that was a bigger mistake than even we realized at the time, because it potentially seeded the entire state of Florida, where perhaps he could have competed more aggressively with Joe Biden. What's your take?
Bringing up Fidel Castro sounds like old people talk to a lot of younger people, and even younger Latinos, younger Cubans. Casey, we've been looking at the state of Florida for so long and that key Latino vote there that is so strong and powerful. And, of course, the Cuban vote kind of dominated it for years. Over the course of time, we've seen that Latino vote in Florida change quite a lot. You're seeing more people coming in from Central America. You're seeing a lot more Puerto Ricans in Florida. You're seeing more Mexican in Florida. So that sort of Cuban influence has diluted a little bit. But let's face it, it's still there and it's still powerful. Even if younger Cubans don't sort of react reflexively to the mention of Fidel the way their parents did, it's still not a very safe route to go in the state of Florida, which is already a state that is just sort of teetering on the knife's edge between Democrats and Republicans. It always comes down to just a few thousand votes in Florida in this enormous state in the general election. So any little thing is going to matter. And in this case, this is a vulnerability, has been a vulnerability for Senator Sanders, praising the Cuban dictator in a way that is going to sort of bring back a lot of very negative and anxious feelings for particularly that older crowd of Cubans who still are very, very influential. So, yeah, it was not perhaps the best move there. I mean, obviously, Senator Sanders has been looking at the other states next Tuesday, looking perhaps for a win in Ohio, something that's a little bit more favorable to his coalition or the coalition he thought he had. Arizona, as Von Hilliard was pointing out, where he does have support of Mexican Americans and other Latino voters in that state. But look, we saw the coalition that he really had hoped to build there in Michigan, so similar to Ohio, not come through for him tonight. So it's really hard to see how that is going to really change much of anything for him next week. And meanwhile, he's got this deficit in Florida.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And Karine Jean-Pierre, I'm curious, you sit at a very interesting intersection as this party grapples with what to do. Many of MoveOn.org's members, very liberal. We've seen a lot of very liberal voters backing Bernie Sanders. On the other hand, we've seen African-American voters overwhelmingly going for Joe Biden. So, I mean, my question to you, sitting here watching tonight unfold, do you think that this race is over?
You know, it certainly is an uphill battle for Bernie Sanders now. I mean, he needed, like I said before, needed to have a win, a big win in Michigan. Michigan was the state tonight that had the most delegates, and we knew that that Biden was going to do well in Missouri. Biden was going to do well in Mississippi in a way that he would get overwhelming delegates. And so this is about the math. You know, this is, like I said before, this is math, narrative, and to some extent message. And Bernie, unfortunately, is kind of behind the eight ball on it. And, I was just thinking about what Mark was saying about where Biden was just a couple of weeks ago. And Biden didn't have an operation. He didn't have any money. And his firewall was South Carolina. And black voters came out and gave him that momentum. Bernie Sanders has, in February, raised $44 million. He has money to go right to the convention. And he had an amazing operation. And so I think, once again, voters are being very clear on what they want. They want to stop the madness that is coming from the Trump administration. And it's not that they don't like Bernie. It's just that they have decided to coalesce behind one candidate. And it's going to be very difficult for Bernie to win this math or get back on track.
Well, even as I'm listening to you make that series of points, all good ones, you think ahead to the fact that Democrats, because of the previous state of Joe Biden's campaign, they have a lot of work to do to get the Biden campaign up to speed to run against Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. And look, Biden has been able to raise some money online since his South Carolina win. And so that'll be good. I'm sure they will be making some changes to their campaign. I wouldn't be surprised if we see movement in the next couple of days, and they will get on track and try to have an operation that can take on Donald Trump. We have to remember, and you know this, Casey, Donald Trump has raised a ton of money, and he has had no opponent on his side. And they are flooding Facebook and online, and they have a real operation, an operation that he didn't have in 2016. So this will be an uphill battle for Democrats, whoever is the nominee.
All right, I'm making a mental note about what you said, Karine, about potential changes just in the coming days. Excellent perspective, as always. We're going to turn now to Chris Jansing, who is in Michigan, where we've just gotten an update from election officials there. Chris, what have we learned?
Well, back in 2018, they actually amended the state constitution. The whole idea, Casey, was to make it easier for people to vote. So they did two main things. There were some hiccups today. Let's start with the first one, which is same-day voter registration, something, again, Michigan had never had before. 13,000 people showed up at their local clerk's office to register same day. Here's the key. Half of those came after 4:30. So essentially in the last 3.5 hours of voting, all these people showed up at clerk's offices to register and then vote. Many of them, according to the Secretary of State a short time ago, these offices might handle 30 a day, and they were getting hundreds of people. They anticipated a lot of people might want to same-day register. They don't have control about how these offices staff up, so it's going to be definitely a lesson for them because they simply weren't able to handle the numbers that they thought they might be able to. also, because of that, you had some really long lines. Many of these first-time voters were young people, so listen to the places where they had these problems, and you'll know what I'm talking about, Casey. Kalamazoo, Ann Arbor, East Lansing, obviously big college towns, Grand Rapids and Dearborn as well. And so they had people there, like we've seen at some other places, handing out pizza, but for many of them, then the wait was as long as 2 hours. The second part of that, of this 2018 change in the Constitution, you and I talked about a little earlier, and that is no reason absentee balloting. That just means that you can get an absentee ballot for any reason at all. They got requests for almost 1 million of them. About 800,000 came back, but the state legislature decreed you couldn't start counting them until this morning. And if you didn't have the staff to do that, to start counting this morning, if you didn't hire extra people, weren't able to find extra people to hire, you haven't gotten your numbers in yet, and they don't expect to have all of these numbers in until sometime early tomorrow afternoon. Look, big picture, the Secretary of State wanted to paint a very positive picture of what we did. She said this is a new day for democracy, that what they wanted to happen happened. More people came out to vote. More first-time voters came out to vote. But she also acknowledged that come November, they're going to have to figure out how to work out some of these kinks. Casey.
Yeah, no, fair enough. All right, Chris Jansing, thank you very much. Always great to see you. As we approach the top of the hour, we want to check back in with Mike Memoli in Philadelphia, who is waiting for Joe Biden, expected to give remarks later on tonight. Mike, since we last spoke, I mean, what is the sense behind the scenes in the Biden campaign about how this race goes forward? He still has a one-on-one debate with Bernie Sanders, then another set of contests coming up next Tuesday. Do they feel as though this race should be over, or what's the posture?
Yeah, Casey, a Biden advisor just telling me that when they had mapped out the calendar from the very beginning, this was a night that they looked at as one of the toughest ones for them, especially given what we saw in terms of the results in 2016. Obviously, there are some primary states tonight that were caucus states, and so the results are a bit skewed there. But you look at a Michigan, you look at a Washington state, and you look at a North Dakota, and they were prepared to take some delegate hits tonight. So far, as this advisor puts it, they're 3 for 3 and potentially going to gain more, especially on the delegate front as the night goes on. In terms of what we're going to see tonight, we're operating, Casey, on Biden time. We had thought we were going to hear from him potentially at around 9:30. We haven't seen him arrive just yet. They didn't have, obviously, tonight the kind of crowd they wanted to have in Cleveland. Ohio voters get a jump start on the next round of primaries. But it is interesting. The room has filled here actually with a lot of staff from Biden headquarters. They've come over here to the Constitution Center for what is going to be a victory lap and an important opportunity for them to message the road ahead, which is that Biden, as he's been saying all week, is the one who is driving the turnout and the enthusiasm among Democrats, not Bernie Sanders.
All right, Mike Memoli, thank you very much. Your many years of covering the former vice president and his various campaigns really paying off for all of our viewers tonight and into the next months of this campaign. Thank you, my friend. All right, some final thoughts here as we head towards 10 o'clock. Mark Murray, the delegate race seems like it's headed in Biden's direction. When do you think we'll know whether he's got this essentially in the bag? Oh,
the past 2 weeks couldn't have gone better for Joe Biden. These were actually supposed to be Bernie Sanders' stronger weeks when you looked at Super Tuesday, this what we're calling above average Tuesday, Super Tuesday 2. And then all of a sudden, as Kerry was mentioning, next week, you end up having Florida and Ohio. You end up having Arizona. And then the next week after that is Georgia, and Florida and Georgia in particular could be very, very tough. One thing I'm looking for Joe Biden in his speech and also going forward is how does he address the future? He ended up when he got the endorsements from Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, he talked about a bridge. But to me, one of the things, instead of like the comforting person that you can have from Joe Biden, which seems to be working well, what is missing is what does the future end up looking like for the party?
Carrie Dan, we got 20 seconds.
I feel like we're going to have a lot of conversations about who Joe Biden might pick as his vice presidential nominee. To Mark's point there, how do you speak to the future? How do you say, yes, I'm going to be, if he is elected president, would be the oldest president inaugurated, but it can also reach out to young voters, particularly those who love Bernie Sanders and aren't so enthusiastic about Joe Biden.
Right, and balancing that with reaching out to disaffected Republicans, too. Shauna.
And turnout seems to be going in an upwards direction with Michigan as compared to 2016. And I will say, even with what Chris Jansing was saying about the difficulty of counting the votes and first-time voters showing up and doing it today, making it easier to vote means you have a more representative electorate voting. So voters voting is not a bad thing.
Never a bad thing in this great democracy. This has been a great evening with all of you. Mark Murray, Carrie Dan, Shauna Thomas, thank you for spending a couple hours with us. Karine Jean-Pierre, Beth Fooey in New York, thanks to both of you as well. Again, we have been covering a big night for Joseph Robinette Biden. He has pulled ahead of Bernie Sanders. We projected 3 wins for him. Some more states still to come. Stay with NBC News Now for continuing coverage throughout the evening.